Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. At 25, I embarked on a solo trip to Seattle. The main reason was to attend my favorite band's concert that weekend. But the city had long been on my list of desired destinations. Traveling alone wasn't a novelty for me. I'd done it many times before, and things always turned out fine. To save money, I opted for an Airbnb a bit away from downtown. A charming little house with a modern, impeccably clean interior. Very comfortable. I arrived on Friday, unpacked my bags, had a quick dinner, and prepared for the big night. The concert was in an incredible venue, a rooftop bar that had a stunning view of the city. The night was excellent. Beyond the amazing music, I met some really cool people. James, Ian, and Jess. Ian and Jess were a couple, while James seemed to be tagging along as a solitary friend. The next day, we met up again and spent the day together. We had lunch and explored some famous tourist spots, like the Space Needle and Pike Place Market, before hitting the beaches. It was fun, but they already had tickets for a show that night, which left me alone again. I didn't mind much. I took the opportunity to explore Seattle at my own pace. When hunger struck, I began walking back toward my Airbnb, passing through a residential area of the city. During the walk, I found a restaurant that caught my attention. Despite my basic Spanish, I managed well in places where there were signs that English was understood. The menu in the window had some translations, so I decided to go in. The restaurant was small with subdued lighting, almost shadowy. It was one of the few accessible places in that area, where prices tended to be high. The space was narrow and long, with few people present. Some tables further back were occupied, but the place was far from crowded. I ended up sitting near a mature-looking man, perhaps around 50 years old. He was also alone, and I wondered if he was another tourist like me. Soon the waiter appeared and began speaking in Spanish. With my limited vocabulary, I asked if he spoke English. To my luck, he replied that he did, and so I was able to place my order without difficulties. While placing my order, I noticed that the man at the next table was watching me. That was uncomfortable. After the waiter left, he commented in English with a strong Spanish accent that he thought my Spanish was good. I responded with gracias, but he started talking to me as if he were giving me a Spanish lesson. Although he seemed to think he was being charming, the situation was both annoying and unsettling. I tried to show disinterest by looking at my phone, but he insisted on continuing the conversation, alternating between English and Spanish. To avoid creating a bad atmosphere, I maintained cordiality, trying to respond in Spanish while he corrected each of my mistakes. The conversation revolved around common questions: where I was from, why I was there, how I'd spent the day, and where I was staying. I made up a story about staying at a friend's house, not wanting to reveal that I was alone. The conversation took an even more uncomfortable turn when he said he found my way of speaking Spanish sexy. At that moment, I just hoped he would leave, but I lost hope when the waiter brought his food. Fortunately, my meal didn't take long. I ordered a pork stew, While I ate, he asked if it was good. I replied yes, trying to be brief. Finally, he slowed down the conversation, since he was busy eating. I quickly finished my food and asked for the bill without delay, just to end that uncomfortable moment. However, he also asked for the bill right after me, even without having finished eating. This made me suspicious. As soon as I paid, I left the restaurant. He said something in Spanish as he said goodbye, but I just said bye and continued walking. Outside, it was already night, and the streets were quieter. As I walked, I stopped at an intersection, and looking across, I saw the man. He was watching me but looked away when he noticed I had spotted him. I thought maybe he was following the same path, which could be a coincidence. I continued walking, but looked back from time to time to make sure he was no longer in sight. Upon arriving at the Airbnb, I looked around before entering, and in the distance, I saw the man standing at the corner. He was watching me. My stomach froze. He was following me. I quickly entered, locked the door, and closed all the blinds. Panic took over. Now he knew where I was staying. I called my father, who advised me to check all the locks, and for safety, keep something to protect myself within reach, like a knife. It was Saturday night, and my flight was scheduled for the end of the next day. I still wanted to go out to enjoy the night. I decided to call an Uber to a bar downtown that offered electronic music. I spent a few hours there before returning to the Airbnb, also by Uber. When I returned, slightly drunk, I entered the house and threw myself on the couch to relax. However, something caught my attention. I heard a noise coming from outside, and looking, I saw that the blinds on one of the windows were moving with the wind. I went to the kitchen and realized that the window was open. It was impossible. All the windows were closed because the air conditioning was on. The moment I realized what had happened, I knew I needed to leave the house immediately. I grabbed my phone and called the emergency number. With my limited Spanish, I tried to explain to the operator that someone had broken in. A few minutes later, the police arrived. I was hiding behind a bush across the street and came out of my hiding place as soon as I saw the police cars approaching. One of the officers knew a little English, which made it possible to tell them that the window was open and that I had been followed earlier that night. They entered the house and began shouting words I didn't understand. A few minutes later, what happened seemed surreal. The police came out with the man from the restaurant, handcuffed. Seeing that scene was one of the most impactful moments of my life. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, relief, astonishment, and a fear that still reverberated. The idea of how things could have ended terribly if I hadn't called the police haunted me. Imagining that he could have been hiding in one of the rooms while I was vulnerable was something I preferred not to consider. Fortunately, his carelessness in leaving the window open ended up facilitating his capture. But I also found myself thinking that I should have followed my father's advice and checked all the windows before going out. I never imagined that he would actually climb in to enter. The next day, I left Seattle. Since then, I've never returned, and I'm much more careful when traveling alone. The memory of how close I came to becoming a statistic sometimes keeps me up at night. I don't think I'll ever forget the sight of that man standing at the corner, watching my Airbnb with that predatory gaze. hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. It was my day off, and nearly all my friends were traveling. So I decided to look for a temporary job to earn some extra money. After waiting for a few days, I finally received a call from a restaurant near my home, inviting me for a trial shift. I already had good experience as a server, so I wasn't surprised when the owner decided to hire me. The place had quite a somber vibe. It was small with dim lighting, and sometimes an unpleasant odor lingered in the air. It wasn't the type of environment I would choose to be in, but I needed the money and just thought it would be something temporary until classes resumed at the university. That night, around 10 o'clock, I was alone at the front, finishing cleaning the silverware while waiting for the last table to leave. It was a table occupied by 4 burly men. They had a rough appearance. Honestly, if I had crossed them on the street, I might have thought they were homeless. After about 30 minutes, they finally stood up to leave. I smiled, trying to be polite, when one of them approached to pay the bill. "That's $42.50, I informed him. He handed over a wad of crumpled bills, smiling broadly. Unfortunately, I already recognized that type of smile and prepared myself to hear some cheap pickup line. As expected, he said, "Gonna do anything interesting tonight, princess," while moving even closer to the counter. "Thank you, have a good night," I responded, trying to be firm while avoiding prolonging the moment. He gave a mocking laugh and left, muttering something as he passed through the door. As soon as he disappeared from my sight, I hurried to collect the plates. I finished cleaning the space and went to change out of my uniform. I quickly said goodbye to the last kitchen helper and left, entering the darkness of the night. My house was just a few blocks from the restaurant, and to save on gas, I always walked there at the end of my shift. I had walked about 5 minutes when I heard a loud whistle coming from somewhere behind me. I looked toward where the sound came from, and my heart raced. It was the same man from the restaurant. He was on the other side of the street, waving at me with that strange smile stamped on his face. I paused for a moment, but my instincts soon spoke louder, and I began to walk faster. I still had about 10 minutes to get home, and I could feel he was getting closer with each second. Thousands of terrifying thoughts went through my mind. I knew very well that this could end in a terrible way. When I turned a corner, I began to run on the sidewalk. Tears were already filling my eyes as I heard his heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. That's when suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder forcefully and pull me back roughly. I spun around and came face to face with the man. His face was red, and that disturbing smile was now an expression laden with fury. He put his finger to his lips and whispered coldly, "Don't scream or I'll cut you." At that moment, I was ready to accept the worst, when something unexpected took over me. A wave of fierce anger exploded inside me. Without thinking twice, I grabbed the man's face and dug my nails forcefully into his eyes. He let out a grotesque, agonizing scream, bringing his hands to his face in desperation. Taking advantage of the opportunity, I ran away with all my strength. I ran without stopping until I reached my apartment. My hands were shaking so much that it was a challenge to put the key in the lock, but I finally managed to get in. As soon as the door closed behind me, I collapsed on the floor, completely exhausted and overwhelmed by tears. My roommates rushed downstairs to find out what had happened. They took me to the couch, and between sobs, I managed to tell them what I had just experienced. Their reaction was a mixture of shock and relief, grateful that I had managed to escape from that terrible situation. The next day, I mustered the courage to call the restaurant and quit. It was a difficult decision because the owners were extremely kind, and I had no real problem with the work or the environment. But the fear of crossing paths with that man again made it impossible to continue. With the start of classes at the university, I began to resume my routine, and little by little, I'm recovering from that frightening experience. Still, sometimes the nightmares appear, bringing vivid images of what could have happened had I not reacted as I did that night. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of the attack itself. It's the realization that this man, who now knows where I work, what I look like, and the general direction of where I live, is still out there. The police searched, but couldn't find him based on my description. There's something about his eyes that haunts me. They didn't look human. There was no emotion in them, just cold calculation. I've taken self-defense classes since then, but I still find myself looking over my shoulder constantly, especially when walking at night. My roommates have been great, making sure I'm never alone when coming home after dark. They even pooled together to buy me a personal alarm and pepper spray. I'm incredibly grateful for their support, but I can't help but wonder if it will be enough if he ever decides to return. I've seen enough crime documentaries to know that men like him rarely stop after one attempt. That's what scares me the most, not knowing if I'm still being watched, if he's waiting for another opportunity. The restaurant is only a few blocks from our apartment complex, after all. Sometimes I think I see him in crowds or passing by in cars, but I can never be sure if it's really him or just my imagination playing tricks on me. The fear has become a constant companion, a shadow that follows me even in broad daylight. But I refuse to let it control my life completely. I'm focusing on my studies, spending time with friends in safe places, and trying to move forward. I've learned that the world can be a dangerous place, especially for women. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. That night changed me forever. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. But I'm also more determined not to become a victim. If he's still out there watching me, waiting for another chance, he should know one thing. I won't be caught off guard again. A couple's dispute I worked for a while in bars and pubs in Boston. An experience I would hardly recommend to anyone. Still, the job paid the bills and had the bonus of being surrounded by friends. So I persisted for a few years. I eventually got a promotion to supervisor, and one of my responsibilities was to keep the cash registers organized, ensure there was enough change, prevent scattered bills, and keep everything in order. The problem: the cash registers were a real headache. I remember one particularly chaotic Saturday night. When opening the drawer of one of the registers, it simply escaped from its hinges, and there was no way to fit it back in. There I was, huffing with frustration and letting out curses, while they called a staff member to ask them to bring the general manager. Meanwhile, I was stuck holding the drawer full of money, because leaving a pile of cash exposed on the counter with a crowd of drunk people nearby was asking for trouble. While waiting, I remained vigilant, making sure no one dared to jump over the counter and grab a handful of bills. Above me was a small staircase leading to a round bar used to serve cocktails. But that night, the space was closed. As there was no one attending there, I didn't have a clear view of what was happening in that area. Suddenly, something bizarre happened. A man passed by the round bar, lifted one of the small red leather stools above his head, and threw it to the floor with force. From where I was, I couldn't see exactly what was going on. I just realized that something very strange was happening. Now, the most logical thing would be to continue taking care of the money. But if this guy was loose throwing furniture around, I needed to find out what he had done before alerting security to remove him from there. I put the drawer on the floor and asked the staff member who was with me to watch it as if their life depended on it. Then I ran up to the round bar. What I saw there left me perplexed. On the red leather stools, hidden from where I was previously, there were two girls. One of them was crying uncontrollably, something I wouldn't have noticed before because of the loud music, while the other tried to calm her down. That's when I noticed the horror. The mouth of the girl who was crying was gushing blood. Then it clicked. The guy who threw the stool on the floor had actually lifted the seat above his head and used it to hit the girl directly in the face. Without thinking twice, I jumped over the counter and ran to the girl. I knelt beside her to assess the damage. It was unbelievable. The amount of blood coming from her mouth was absurd, as if she had poured an entire bottle of tomato juice into her mouth and let it drip. Her eyes, full of tears, met mine, and then she spat out a bunch of teeth on the floor right in front of me. I'd never experienced anything like it during my time working in bars. I had witnessed some fights, but nothing even close to the injuries that girl suffered. In an almost automatic impulse, I went after the guy who had hit her. I ran toward the front of the bar, spotted his orange shirt, and without hesitation, jumped to immobilize him until the police arrived. While holding the guy, I was still in a state of shock. I couldn't believe that he had assaulted a girl like that, apparently for no reason at all. I asked, almost shouting, You hit that girl. Why? What was going through your head?" He showed no reaction, just stared at me. It was then that I realized he was French, and apparently didn't understand English, especially with my Boston accent. I was still trying to process the situation when I noticed that his gaze shifted to something behind me. You know, that kind of expression that makes your instinct scream that you need to look back now. Well, that's exactly what it was. I turned around, and to my astonishment, I saw the girl, still with her mouth bleeding, walking in our direction with an empty wine bottle firmly gripped in her hand. My first reaction was to think she was going to hit the guy with it, something he frankly deserved. But if I let an incident like that happen, goodbye probationary period as a supervisor. I raised my hands and tried to intervene. "Don't do it, honey." I was ready to prevent her from passing by me and hitting the guy. Only she didn't try to pass by. Instead, she stared directly at me. Blood was still flowing from her lips, but the tears had disappeared. What I saw in her eyes was pure hatred, a gaze so intense it was genuinely frightening. It seemed that all the pain and frustration had transformed into fury. Then suddenly, she raised the bottle above her head and ran in my direction. With no time to think, I let out, "Hey, hey." It wasn't me. I didn't do anything, but it was useless. She had already made her decision, and with all her strength, she brought the bottle down toward the right side of my face and neck. It was a brutal blow, the kind that could have broken the glass against my face, tearing my skin, and perhaps even cutting my carotid artery. A blow like that could have been fatal, something straight out of Kill Bill, with blood spurting from the neck with each heartbeat. If she had hit me that way, I would have been finished in a matter of minutes, right there on the bar floor. You know that thing they say about time slowing down in moments like these? It's true, but not because time actually gets slower. It's the brain that accelerates, stimulated by adrenaline. So while I saw the bottle coming down toward me, something inside me reacted in a reflex that I don't even know where it came from. I raised the side of my right hand to intercept the blow. I didn't feel the glass breaking on my hand. It was as if the bottle simply disappeared in the air. But at that instant, I knew that something serious had happened. I didn't need to look to understand that the damage had already been done. The first thing I remember is holding my wrist tightly, cursing while backing up to the bar. I needed to check how serious the cut was, but the girl had already disappeared into the agitated crowd. There was something inside me that was reluctant to look at the wound, as if ignoring it was the same as making it not exist. Still, I knew I couldn't avoid it. It was only when I saw blood starting to drip on the floor that I gathered the courage to take a look. When I finally looked, what I saw was horrifying. The cut was so deep that it revealed the muscle in my hand, not something I wanted to see, especially while the other staff member was running to fetch security. I grabbed some paper towels, wrapped them around my hand, and pressed as hard as I could to try to contain the bleeding. That should have been the end of the confusion. I should have just waited for the ambulance and left everything in the hands of security. But as I was thinking about this, I realized that the girl, the one who had nearly taken my life, would still be in the bar. As much as she also needed medical help, I couldn't just let such a violent attack pass without consequences. So I asked the security guards to help me search the crowd for her. And since we were at it, also for the man who had started it, all by hitting her with the stool. It was only when I began moving through the crowded bar that I realized how risky what I was doing was. The dimly lit environment, full of drunk people dancing, made it almost impossible to distinguish anyone. Suddenly, it seemed like a scene from the second Jurassic Park movie. The crowd was like tall grass, and she was a predator lying in wait. All she needed to do was approach in the middle of the people, like in a game of Assassin's Creed, and I would only realize it when it was too late. This thought hit me like a punch, the idea that next time I might not be able to react quickly enough, aware that she could attack me again and leave me with irreversible injuries, or even worse. It left me terrified. I felt my breathing accelerate, and before I knew it, I was hyperventilating. I hastily returned to the bar, where there seemed to be at least relative safety, and asked the security guards to look for the girl with the bleeding mouth. It was at that moment that I saw the glow of blue lights flashing outside, coming through the large glass windows. It was the police, along with an ambulance. A coworker quickly gathered my things from the staff room and accompanied me outside, where the paramedics made an initial dressing before taking me to the hospital. I arrived at the emergency room around 3 in the morning on Sunday. Waits in Boston hospitals are already long under normal conditions, but at the time I arrived, it was almost unbearable, and not because of boredom. My stay there was anything but monotonous. The place was packed with people with serious, though not fatal, injuries. Drunk people moaned, holding broken hands or displaying deep cuts on their heads. 2 women, one of them so injured she could barely stay awake, were openly conversing about being, let's say, professionals of the night. The environment was a chaotic portrait of excesses and violence. And there, I remained waiting, while the chaos around me seemed never to diminish. I did my best to keep my head down and avoid any interaction while waiting. But once called to be attended to, the doctors and nurses were fantastic. I won't lie, there were some unpleasant moments. The doctor needed to remove a part of the tissue from my hand, and even with the local anesthesia, I could still feel the procedure, which was absolutely disturbing. However, they were incredibly careful throughout the process, which helped a lot. After the stitches were done, I found 2 police officers waiting for me outside the emergency room. For a moment, I had hope that they had managed to arrest the 2 responsible individuals and were just there to hear my account. Unfortunately, the news wasn't good. Neither of them had been captured. According to the police, both managed to leave the bar without drawing attention, but some people associated with them were questioned. That's how they discovered that they were actually a couple. At the time, this didn't occur to me, but it soon became clear that the incident was a classic example of someone getting involved in a domestic dispute. In situations like these, the couple often forgets the conflict between them and turns against whoever tried to help. Although this story didn't have a satisfactory ending, as many of these situations don't, there is undoubtedly an important lesson in all of this. Never get involved in a domestic fight. The best thing to do is to keep your distance and call the police to handle the situation. And I say this from personal experience. Trying to intervene can not only cost you a bit of your faith in humanity, but can easily cost your own life. 3 months later, I was back at work with my hand mostly healed, but a new scar I'll carry for life. The most disturbing part was when I reviewed the security footage with my manager. The couple had been arguing all night. In the footage from earlier in the evening, you could see he had grabbed her arm roughly several times, and she had pushed him away. What really sent chills down my spine was that, according to witnesses who had been sitting near them, they weren't even speaking English. They were speaking French to each other. This means they had no idea what I was saying when I confronted the man. For all they knew, I could have been threatening them both. The detective assigned to my case told me that they had a theory. The couple was visiting from Montreal and had a history of domestic violence calls. Apparently, this was a pattern for them. They would get into violent altercations in public, and when someone intervened, they would unite against the third party. The police in several northeastern cities had reports of similar incidents matching their description. I sometimes wonder what happened to them. Did they continue their toxic relationship? Did one of them eventually seriously harm the other? Or Or did they get help and break the cycle of violence? I'll never know, but the scar on my hand serves as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous situations are the ones you think you understand, but actually don't. These days, when I see couples arguing in public, I keep my distance and dial 911 if things look serious. No good deed goes unpunished, as they say. I learned that lesson the hard way. Victor Kowalski, 30 years old, was originally from the quiet village of Rutherford, located in upstate New York. Since 2011, he and his father had established a routine as construction workers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they sought better opportunities. This choice, however, brought significant weight to Victor's relationship with his longtime partner, who was pregnant with their first child and lived in Pine Grove, a small town in western Pennsylvania. Determined to provide the best possible future for his new family, Victor decided to leave his hometown and move to Philadelphia, attracted by the higher wages. He had promised his child's mother that he would do everything possible to be present for the birth. So when he received the long-awaited call on March 28, 2018, informing him that his fiancée had gone into labor, he didn't hesitate. Without wasting time, Victor got into his 1998 BMW 525 and took full advantage of the absence of speed limits on some parts of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He quickly crossed the interior of Pennsylvania toward Pine Grove. The news came at 11:30 at night, and the 400 miles to Pine Grove promised a long journey. Victor expected to arrive between 8 and 9 o'clock the following morning. Unfortunately, Victor never reached his destination. Later, when questioned by investigators, Victor's father reported receiving a call from his son on the morning of March 29th. It was approximately 10:30 when Victor told him he was stuck in a major traffic jam near Allentown, a Pennsylvania city a little more than 100 miles from Pine Grove, about 2 hours before his expected arrival. Victor also sent a text message to his fiancée, letting her know he was close and confident that he could still attend the birth. However, that was the last news from Victor. As the hours passed and the birth approached, Victor's absence became an increasingly anguishing mystery. His fiancée, in addition to facing the emotional strain of the moment, was worried about his inexplicable silence. Victor wasn't answering calls or responding to messages. Alarmed, she contacted his sister around 5 in the afternoon, describing the situation and revealing that her brother's phone was ringing, but no one was answering. This sudden disappearance left everyone deeply concerned. It made no sense that Victor, aware of the urgency, would ignore the attempts to contact him. Even if he had stopped to rest or refuel, nothing justified the absolute silence. For his family and fiancée, the only plausible explanation was that something very serious had happened, preventing Victor from fulfilling his desire to be present for the birth of his first child. That same night, Victor's mother contacted the local police in Pennsylvania. But since her son's disappearance was recent, they refused to file a report, believing he would probably reappear soon. However, days passed without any news of Victor. Meanwhile, his baby was born, and both his fiancée and his family were consumed with worry. They then sought help from the police authorities in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, thinking he might have taken a detour. However, the responses were discouraging. The Pennsylvania police refused to open an investigation, arguing that the responsibility now fell on their New Jersey colleagues. Throughout the investigation, the lack of cooperation between the two departments became evident. Both forces seemed reluctant to share information or coordinate efforts, with each side insisting that the greater responsibility lay with the other. A clear example of this impasse was the family's request for the Pennsylvania police to track Victor's phone, which apparently remained active for a few days after his disappearance. However, the Pennsylvania police claimed they couldn't locate the device because the SIM card was from a New Jersey operator. When the New Jersey police were approached, the response was no different. They claimed they couldn't help since the disappearance occurred in Pennsylvania territory. Later, the Pennsylvania authorities suggested that in reality, Victor's cell phone had never connected to a network in Pennsylvania, raising doubts about whether he had actually crossed into the state. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Victor's family decided to take the initiative and conduct their own investigation. They gathered friends, relatives, and even hired private detectives to exhaustively examine the route between Philadelphia and Pine Grove. They traveled alternative roads, requested security camera footage from businesses near the routes, and talked with gas station attendants. They carried photos of Victor, showing them to everyone they encountered in the hope of triggering a memory. Despite all efforts, no one recognized Victor or was able to offer useful information. 6 months passed without any sign of Victor. The disappearance was not only disconcerting, but also strange due to the disappearance of his car and phone, making it especially difficult to imagine that a vehicle could simply vanish without a trace. During this period, the family appeared on news programs and reports in Pennsylvania, making emotional appeals for information and denouncing the inertia of the Pennsylvania and New Jersey police, who they said were not committed to finding the missing worker. On September 12th, when Victor's family was beginning to lose hope of finding him, a neighbor of his mother approached her house with a peculiar concern. The unbearable smell coming from the family barn near the neighbor's property suggested that perhaps one of the animals housed there had died, especially because the odor became more noticeable during the warmer periods of the day. Victor's mother went to check and found that all the animals were alive and healthy, although the smell persisted. The barn had a walled area used as a storage for agricultural equipment. This part of the structure left a small space at the top, a type of loft that until then had not been examined. Determined to investigate, Victor's mother, with the help of the neighbor, climbed up with a ladder to the location. What they found was terrifying. At the top, it initially appeared to be a pile of clothes, along with 2 ropes hanging from the beams and a backpack. However, when they illuminated the area better, they discovered it was a human body in an advanced state of decomposition, still dressed in the clothes from the time of death. The body was without a head, which had been separated from the body. The state of the body made immediate recognition impossible. Despite Victor not having planned to go to Rutherford, his hometown, but to Pine Grove, located an impressive 375 miles away. The body was identified as his, to the family's despair. The death was officially classified as suicide, a conclusion considered absurd by the family, as one of the shoes found in the barn had a severed foot still inside it. Additionally, it was discovered that several teeth had been pulled out, and parts of his clothes were stuck in a mass of dried organs. The evidence clearly indicated that Victor had suffered extreme violence and dismemberment, raising serious doubts about the investigation. While it's true that the separation of a skull from a hanged body can occur naturally after a period of decomposition, the pulled teeth were an evident sign of something much more sinister. A particularly strange detail was the presence of an empty orange juice bottle found in the backpack left in the barn. According to the family, Victor detested orange juice or anything citrus, which for them was an indication that someone could have planted the object to divert attention. Still, the Pennsylvania police dismissed the relevance of this item and did not conduct fingerprint or DNA analysis on the bottle, further frustrating the family members. The biggest enigma in this case, beyond the circumstances of Victor's death, is the fate of his car. The 1998 BMW 525 used on the trip from Philadelphia was never located, either in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Curiously, neither the keys nor the vehicle documents, which theoretically should have been in Victor's wallet, were found. His wallet, in turn, was discovered inside the backpack left in the barn. The most disconcerting detail is that even if Victor had appeared in his hometown at some point, no one saw him or spotted his car. It's as if he had returned to the village invisibly to end his own life in the family barn. However, it's evident that the case has layers of mystery, and the reasons for this supposed suicide, especially considering that Victor had just become a father, are deeply questionable. The Pennsylvania authorities and the state prosecutor remain firm in the conclusion that the death was a suicide and refuse to continue the investigations despite repeated appeals from family and friends, who believe the case was handled negligently. Some might consider this police resistance as a family's denial in accepting that Victor took his own life. But analyzing the revealed details, it's difficult not to suspect serious flaws in the investigation. The lack of commitment from the authorities in seriously exploring all possibilities only increases the frustration. Victor was a young father, had a dedicated fiancée, and was thriving in his construction career. There were no evident signs indicating intent to commit suicide. On the other hand, it's important to remember that disorders like depression can be invisible and devastating, which prevents this hypothesis from being completely ruled out, even with evidence contradicting it. However, given the authorities' refusal to delve deeper into the case, perhaps the truth about what happened to Victor will never come to light. If he was truly a victim of a crime, and his death was carefully staged to appear as a suicide, it's possible that the person responsible for this act is still free. This raises the possibility that someone has escaped the consequences of a murder, moving throughout the northeastern United States without fear of being discovered. The most disturbing theory is that someone had Victor killed to silence him. The timing of his disappearance, right as he was about to become a father, and the brutal way his body was treated suggest this wasn't a random crime or a suicide. Some family members believe Victor may have accidentally discovered something illegal at his construction job, perhaps related to money laundering or organized crime. The fact that investigating authorities so quickly ruled it a suicide, despite clear evidence of violence, has led some to wonder if there was pressure from powerful individuals to close the case. The jurisdictional disputes between Pennsylvania and New Jersey police could have been deliberately exploited to ensure a thorough investigation never happened. For now, Victor's fiancée is raising their child alone, a child who will grow up only knowing their father through photographs and stories told by family. And somewhere, perhaps, there's someone who knows exactly what happened during those missing hours between Philadelphia and Rutherford, someone who has yet to be brought to justice. On December 14th, 2014, a young man was walking through the woods near the secondary roads of Beaver County, Pennsylvania. He was following a trail surrounded by silent trees, about 30 feet from the nearest path. The calm, almost forgotten region was less than a mile from a paved road that cut through a small residential neighborhood with very few houses and sparse traffic. Just a shortcut used by those who knew the area well to access Route 989. Lost in his own thoughts, the young man was enjoying the serenity of nature without suspecting what awaited him. It was an unusual detail that caught his attention amidst the winter-faded landscape. Something completely clashed with the scenery, an image loaded with a strange, morbid weight, something that made his heart race as soon as he understood what was before him. In an instant of pure terror, he turned and ran, screaming and crying while his body trembled with fear. What he had found on that somber December day was a human head, separated from its body. But this wasn't a typical scene of a recent crime. The head was embalmed and perfectly preserved. Hours later, when authorities arrived at the scene, they noted that the head's eyes were closed, but the mouth remained open, as if frozen in a final scream. A meticulous search was conducted in the surroundings for clues or the rest of the body, but no trace was found. The preservation of the head was impressive. The face was still perfectly recognizable. Despite this, subsequent attempts at facial reconstruction did not lead to any concrete identification. Experts believed the head had been left there between 7 days and a month before being discovered, resting among dead leaves, waiting for a curious eye. The gray hair suggested that the woman to whom the head belonged was between 50 and 80 years old. Milna Witt, a renowned forensic anatomy professor, was called to examine the find in detail. After hours of meticulous analysis, Milna reached a disturbing conclusion. Whoever had separated the head from the body possessed the skills of a trained professional, probably with training in anatomy or medicine. The precision with which the act was performed recalled the macabre acts of Jack the Ripper, the infamous 19th century murderer. When we removed the flap of skin at the back of the neck, it became clear that the goal was to access a specific joint that would ensure the preservation of the head and column. Milna explained to local reporters in an interview that shocked the community. This wasn't done with just any knife or by someone without experience. It was meticulous work, executed with professional skill. She was dismembered with surgical precision. Another indication that reinforced the idea that the person responsible for decapitating the head had professional training was the use of devices known as ocular plugs, commonly employed by funeral directors. These small instruments, similar to contact lenses, have a rather peculiar function. They are inserted between the eyeball and the eyelid of a deceased person, featuring small protrusions that have the natural curvature of the eye, while ensuring that the eyelid remains closed. During the analysis of the embalmed head, pathologists removed the plugs and made disturbing discoveries. Not only had the eyeballs been extracted, but they had also been replaced with small red rubber balls, similar to those used by children in games. Whoever performed such an act revealed a macabre sense of humor, and undoubtedly a deeply disturbed mind. To continue the investigations, the head was sent to ISOF Forensics, an institution located in Salt Lake City specialized in isotopic tests. For those unfamiliar with the technique, isotopes are particles present in the human body from consumed water that can be traced to a specific geographic area. The results of the analysis revealed that in the months prior to her death, the woman led a nomadic life, having passed through locations such as West Virginia, Western Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania, and even parts of Eastern Ohio and New York. Although the data suggested that the woman moved through various regions, there was no concrete evidence that she had lived in Beaver County before her death. Moreover, the use of embalming fluid complicated any attempt to determine the exact moment of death, as the liquid destroyed the nucleotide bonds necessary for DNA analysis. The small amount of genetic material that was recovered was so degraded that it could not be compared to any other sample available in the national database. However, toxicological tests brought some relief to investigators, indicating that her death was not the result of a criminal act. The substances found in her body, lidocaine and atropine, both commonly used in the treatment of heart problems, pointed to a probable cardiac arrest as the cause of death. Still, the idea of a natural death didn't convince everyone. A detective specialized in homicides expressed skepticism, mentioning that in many cases, killers demonstrate possessiveness by manipulating and playing with their victims' bodies. In an interview, Beaver County medical examiner Carla Miller pondered, could it have been someone with extensive knowledge of anatomy? Yes. Could it have just been someone eccentric or peculiar? Also yes. The truth is that at this moment, we don't have definitive answers. John Clark, police chief of the district, categorically stated that the location of the embalmed head was so far from the road that it would be impossible for it to have been thrown from a moving vehicle. Additionally, analyses showed that the odor and taste of the embalming fluid made the flesh completely uninteresting to scavenger animals, eliminating the hypothesis that it could have been left by some hungry predator. The placement of the head was clearly intentional. Whoever positioned it there wanted it to be found sooner or later. Various funeral homes affiliated with the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association were contacted for information, and details of this bizarre case were even shared at a national conference of funeral directors. However, no one was able to clarify the situation. Virtually all theories, except that of grave robbery, were discarded. The most plausible explanation, in the view of the majority, is that the owner of the embalmed head had been a victim of the illegal trade in human remains, a shadowy practice that can serve both professional and recreational purposes. There is a black market for body parts, and it is significantly broad, commented Robert, the district attorney of Beaver County. Investigators reiterated the possibility that the head had been removed from the body of a victim who died of natural causes by a body broker, a term used to describe individuals or companies that buy and sell cadavers or mortal parts. This theory gains strength considering that similar abusive practices have already been associated with this illegal industry in the past. The difficulty in tracing the origin of the head is due, according to Professor Malna Vitali, to the large number of companies involved in the trade of human remains. She believes that to identify the owner of the embalmed head, the assistance of a dentist will be essential. Forensic examinations revealed that the woman had dental procedures on all teeth, with one tooth having undergone up to 7 interventions. In 3 teeth that were extracted, specialists found a filling material that only became available after 2004, indicating that the woman's death occurred after this year. Although the dental work has been analyzed in detail, it has not yet led to concrete clues. However, investigators hope that forensic facial reconstruction may one day lead to the identification of the woman, returning her identity even in death. Even after almost 10 years, the identity of the woman and who decapitated or stole her head remains shrouded in mystery, as does who decided to position the head in those quiet woods of Pennsylvania. But perhaps the most disturbing question is, do we really want to know the whole story behind this case? Or perhaps it might be better for our peace of mind to remain in a comfortable ignorance. The case has attracted attention from true crime enthusiasts across the country. Some amateur detectives have spent countless hours combing through missing persons reports from the early 2000s, trying to match descriptions to the forensic reconstruction. Various online communities are dedicated to solving the mystery, sharing theories and potential leads. One particularly persistent theory involves a network of funeral homes across several states that may have been engaged in the illegal sale of body parts. Proponents point to a series of unusual deaths and disappearances of funeral home directors in the Northeast during that period. Others believe the head may have belonged to a homeless woman or someone who lived on the fringes of society, someone whose disappearance might not have been widely reported. The isotope analysis suggesting a nomadic lifestyle lends credence to this theory. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the gruesome nature of finding an embalmed head in the woods, but the apparent professional care with which it was handled. This wasn't the work of an amateur or someone in the grip of a psychotic episode. The precision, the use of professional materials, and the deliberate placement all suggest a calculated act. For the residents of Beaver County, the case has become something of a local legend, a story told around campfires and at sleepovers to frighten friends. But for the investigators who have dedicated years to solving this mystery, it remains a frustrating puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit together. Perhaps most chilling of all is the possibility that whoever placed that head in those woods is still out there, going about their life, possibly still working in a profession that gives them access to human remains. And only they know the full truth behind the embalmed head of Beaver County. When When I was 19, I went through a financially tight period and ended up getting a second temporary job as a waitress in a diner. The place stayed open until 3 in the morning during the week and was open 24 hours on weekends. On those weekend nights, the restaurant would fill with drunk young people who appeared after leaving the bars. During the week, the night customers were mostly shift workers or people who had just gotten off work. I worked the graveyard shift twice a week. More than that would be impossible. I think I would pass out from exhaustion. During the week, after 10 at night, I was alone in service since business was quite slow, especially in the early morning hours. One of those nights, around 1 in the morning, a tall man came in alone. There was only one other customer in the restaurant. I'm almost certain I was the one who seated him. He started making conversation with me in a way full of innuendos. It was always like this. The older and less attractive ones were the most insistent. I had to deal with it while smiling after all. My income basically depended on tips. He ordered a hamburger and a milkshake and made a point of telling me his name, Wesley. The whole time, he kept watching me from across the diner, while I tried to distract myself by looking at my phone. He was already the only customer when he called me by name to go to his table. I went over with a smile, and he asked for the check. As soon as he left, I went to collect the tip and clean the table. Besides the $2 tip, Wesley left his phone number written on the receipt, along with a drawing of a winking face. Disgusting. I crumpled up the paper and threw it away. I thought the story would end there, but I was wrong. A few nights later, Wesley appeared again, very late when the restaurant was empty. I greeted him and took him to a table. As soon as he sat down, he said, "How's my favorite waitress tonight?" I found it strange considering I had only served him once before. Once again, he started talking to me, and I was too exhausted to deal with it. But as always, I put a smile on my face and gave him attention. I thought that maybe by being friendlier, he would leave a bigger tip, but that only made the situation worse. He confused my kindness with interest and invited me to go to his boat someday. To keep the conversation going without being rude, I asked what kind of boat he had, and he showed me a picture. It was such a small vessel that it barely seemed to fit 2 people. I replied, "Oh wow, my dad has a boat too," thinking now that it might have been better to say I had a boyfriend. But at the time, my concern was trying to ensure a good tip. When he asked for my number, I explained that I wasn't allowed to give it to customers because it could cost me my job. He seemed to believe it, but before leaving, he left his number again on the receipt, this time accompanied by a note that said something like, "I'm sure you only lost it last time. Don't be shy now, you can text me. It'll be our little secret." And of course, another winking face drawn. And the tip again, $2. Besides everything else, he was a cheapskate who didn't even know how to leave a decent tip. I hoped not to see him again, but of course, this story wouldn't end there. The following week, there he was, during another graveyard shift when I was on duty. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and it seemed like he calculated the moment when the restaurant would be empty, almost as if he had been waiting in the parking lot to ensure I was free. As soon as he entered, the first thing he said was, "You don't mind, right?" But there was no smile. He seemed serious, almost somber. I replied that I was flattered, but that I really couldn't send messages to customers. He fell silent, turned his back, and left. I felt immense relief. Maybe with luck, he would give up on coming back. The next day, while working at my other job, I received a message from a fellow waitress. She asked if I knew who the fat, bald guy was who used to appear in the early morning. I replied that yes, he was creepy, and asked why she was asking. She said he had asked for my full name. I asked if she had given it, and to my discomfort, she confirmed, explaining that he said he wanted the name of the amazing waitress from last night. Later that day, I received a message. It was from him. "Hey, this is Wesley, your favorite customer. I know you said you couldn't give me your number, so I decided to get it on my own. That way you didn't break any rules, haha." I was completely speechless. I immediately blocked the number and hoped that would be the end of it. However, a few days later, when I left work, I found an envelope stuck to my car's windshield wiper. I grabbed the envelope and got into the car to open it. The content was disturbing, a series of photos of me taken from the diner's parking lot. The images got even more uncomfortable. Some showed my apartment with records of me standing on the balcony or unlocking the front door. The worst was a photo taken through the living room window at night. I drove straight to the police station with the photos and the message he had sent. The material was enough to file a complaint. I spent that night at my parents' house. The next day, a detective called Wesley and warned him that if he continued trying to contact me, he would be arrested for harassment. Even so, I quit my job at the diner. It wasn't worth the risk. My lease ended the following month, so I took the opportunity to move to a new apartment. I didn't want to run any risk of him finding me again. It was the only serious case of stalking I've ever faced in my life, and with luck, it will be the last. But as the days passed after moving, the feeling of being watched didn't diminish. I'd see vehicles driving slowly past my new place, nothing I could prove, but enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. I installed additional locks on my doors and windows. I bought pepper spray and kept it with me at all times. One night, about a month after moving, my roommate woke me up around 4 in the morning. She was pale and shaking. "Someone's been in the apartment," she whispered. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What? Did they take anything?" She shook her head. "Nothing's missing, but someone's been here. They left something for you." On the kitchen table was a brown envelope. Inside were more photos, new ones of me at my current apartment, and a handwritten note, "Found you. The police took it seriously this time. They installed a patrol car outside our building, but they couldn't stay forever. After a week with no sign of Wesley, they reduced their presence. The detective assigned to my case suggested I change my routine, my phone number, even my appearance if possible. I dyed my hair from blonde to dark brown. I changed my schedule at work and school. I even started using different entrances and exits to my apartment building. For weeks there was nothing, no sign of Wesley, no photos, no strange cars. I began to relax, thinking perhaps the police intervention had finally scared him off. Then came the night that still gives me nightmares. I was alone in the apartment, my roommate away for the weekend visiting family. Around midnight, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a noise from the fire escape outside my bedroom window. A scraping sound, like metal against metal. I froze, listening intently in the darkness. There it was again. Someone was on the fire escape, trying to open my window. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and my pepper spray and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911. "There's someone trying to break into my apartment," I whispered to the dispatcher. "I think it's the man who's been stalking me." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher instructed. "Officers are on their way. Is there somewhere safe you can hide?" The bathroom had no windows, no other exits. I was trapped. I could hear the window in my bedroom sliding open, the sound of footsteps on the floor. My entire body shook with terror as I heard him moving around my apartment, opening drawers, rummaging through my things. "He's inside," I whispered, barely audible. "He's in my apartment." The doorknob to the bathroom rattled. I held my breath, gripping the pepper spray so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I know you're in there," Wesley's voice came through the door, eerily calm. "I just want to talk, that's all. Don't you think you're overreacting a little?" I remained silent, tears streaming down my face. The rattling intensified. "Open the door." His voice changed, becoming angry, almost feral. "Open it now or I'll break it down." In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Wesley heard them too. "You called them." His voice was incredulous, hurt even. "After everything we've shared. I thought we had something special." The bathroom door shuddered as he slammed his body against it. The hinges creaked. It wouldn't hold for long. "The police are coming," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "They know who you are. They have your photos, your phone number. You should leave now while you still can." Silence. Then a chilling laugh. "They'll never find me, but I'll always find you. Remember that." I heard his footsteps retreating, then the sound of my front door opening and closing. Moments later, police officers were knocking, announcing their presence. When I finally unlocked the bathroom door, my legs gave out, and I collapsed into the arms of a female officer. The police searched the entire building and surrounding area, but found no trace of Wesley. They discovered he had disabled the security camera in the hallway before entering my apartment. The officers took pictures, dusted for fingerprints, and filed a more serious report, breaking and entering, threat to life. But the damage was done. I couldn't stay there anymore. The next day, I withdrew from my classes, quit my job, and moved back in with my parents in another state. It took months of therapy before I could sleep through the night again. Years before I felt comfortable living on my own. The police never caught Wesley. They told me his phone was a burner, untraceable. The name he gave me was probably fake. Sometimes I wonder if he's found another waitress to fixate on. Another woman whose life he can invade and destroy. I still work in the restaurant industry, but I'm much more cautious now. I don't wear a name tag. I don't engage in personal conversations with male customers. I vary my routes home and always check my surroundings. It's been 5 years since I last saw Wesley, but sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night, I still glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him watching me from across the street with that same unsettling smile. The worst part isn't the fear, it's how it changed me. I used to be open, trusting, willing to chat with anyone. Now I see potential threats everywhere, A friendly customer becomes a stalker. A compliment becomes the first step in a dangerous obsession. My therapist says it will get better with time, that I'll learn to distinguish between normal interactions and warning signs. I hope she's right. I don't want to live in fear forever, but I also never want to make the same mistake again. The mistake of thinking that a man's interest is harmless when something in my gut is screaming that it's not. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's to trust my instincts. The first time I met Wesley, something felt off. I ignored that feeling because I was trained to be polite, to smile, to make customers happy. Never again. My safety is worth more than a $2 tip or avoiding an awkward moment. So if you're reading this and something similar happens to you, don't wait. Don't give second chances. Don't worry about seeming rude. Report it immediately. Change your routines. Protect yourself. Because people like Wesley don't just go away, they escalate. And by the time you realize the danger you're in, it might already be too late. In the early 20th century, Maria Zarin fled her homeland of Russia, escaping from the feared Bolsheviks who were transforming the country into the cradle of the political regime that would become the Soviet Union. Her escape route led her to Hong Kong, which at that time was still far from communist rule. The passage through Chinese territory was planned as a brief stopover before reaching the United States. However, it was in this country that the superstitious Maria decided to seek a fortune teller, trying to understand what fate had in store for her. The fortune teller brought excellent news. Maria would not only arrive safely in America, but would also have a daughter whose beauty would achieve worldwide fame. However, she gave a warning. Maria should keep herself and her daughter away from what she called dark waters. After disembarking in San Francisco, Maria gave birth to a girl on July 20th, 1938. She named her Natalia Nikolaevna Zarin. The prophecy about fame came true, but under a very different name. Natalia would be known to the world as Natalie Wood. Maria dedicated herself intensely to preparing her daughter for stardom from her first steps and words, enrolling her in singing, dancing, and acting classes, taking her to film studios, hoping she would be discovered and her destiny fulfilled. However, Maria's dedication frequently exceeded the limits, becoming almost abusive. She was relentless and inflexible, isolating Natalie from her sisters and even ignoring the girl's injuries, believing this would make her stronger. Obsessed with the fortune teller's warning, Maria instilled in Natalie a deep fear of deep and turbulent waters. Despite her efforts, the prophecy nearly came true during the filming of The Green Promise. On set, Natalie was supposed to cross a bridge that, under a simulated storm, would collapse over a pool of agitated water. The director assured that everything was under control, but a technical error caused the bridge to collapse prematurely. Natalie fell into the water, breaking her wrist in the fall. Maria, who was watching the scene, was devastated, certain she was witnessing the drowning prophecy being fulfilled. Fortunately, the production crew acted quickly, helping Natalie out of the water while she struggled with her injured arm. If Natalie didn't fear water before, that moment certainly marked her deeply. Maria, her mother, decided not to seek medical assistance for her daughter's broken wrist, fearing it could harm Natalie's chances of getting work in the future. The fracture ended up leaving scars so evident that she spent years wearing bracelets throughout her life to cover them. For her, the marks weren't just physical, but reminders of one of the most traumatic episodes she had faced. The impact was so great that she never learned to swim and reported panic attacks, even when trying to wash her hair. Despite these painful experiences, Natalie built a long and successful career in cinema, as well as marrying star Robert Wagner. Their relationship was tumultuous, with a divorce and a reconciliation before the birth of the couple's only daughter, Natasha. During the Thanksgiving holiday of 1981, Natalie, Robert, and actor Christopher Walken spent the weekend aboard Wagner's yacht, called the Splendor, near Catalina Island off the California coast. Only the boat's captain, Dennis Davern, accompanied them. The group enjoyed the time shopping, sailing, dining, and drinking excessively. On the night of November 27th, after another round of drinks, a heated argument between Natalie and Robert exploded. The conflict was so intense that Natalie asked Captain Davern to take her to shore in the yacht's small dinghy. She and the captain spent the night in a hotel, and Natalie returned to the boat the next morning, apparently reconciled with Wagner. The next night, the four, Natalie, Robert, Davern, and Walken, went to dinner at a restaurant called Doug's Harbor Reef. The drinking continued, with reports that the group ordered 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and several daiquiris while barely touching the food. They were so inebriated that the restaurant manager reportedly called harbor security to ensure they returned to the boat without incidents. According to Davern, a violent argument occurred on board, involving Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken, who disagreed about politics and the direction of Natalie's career. The confrontation escalated so much that a wine bottle was thrown before Natalie had to intervene to calm things down. After this, the argument turned to be between Natalie and Robert. Witnesses say Natalie declared she was exhausted with the situation before retiring to her room. Around 3:30 in the morning of November 29th, 1981, a call from the Splendor to the mainland was made. Captain Davern informed the United States Coast Guard that Natalie Wood was missing. A search was initiated, and a few hours later, around 8 in the morning, the actress's body was found floating near the boat's inflatable dinghy, the same one she had used to leave the ship 2 days earlier. Natalie was wearing only a nightgown, socks, and a jacket. The autopsy revealed that her blood alcohol level was 0.14%, almost twice the legal limit for driving, and that she had ingested a significant amount of potent painkillers. Natalie was only 43 years old when she died. Despite the gravity of the case, Robert Wagner was not thoroughly questioned by the police on the same day. Only a few days later were the 3 men who were on board that night called to testify. However, each presented a suspiciously similar version of the events. Thus, Natalie's death was recorded as an accidental drowning. The tragedy moved the country, which mourned the loss alongside Wagner. He went on to raise the couple's 2 daughters alone, who were deeply affected by their mother's sudden death. For 3 decades, Natalie's case remained closed until a surprising revelation brought the incident back into the spotlight. Dennis Davern, the captain of the Splendor on that fateful night, broke his silence and admitted he had lied to the authorities. Davern's statement shook public opinion. He revealed that the argument between Walken and Wagner that night didn't originate from political differences, as initially believed, but because Wagner suspected Walken was flirting with Natalie behind his back. Davern reported that the moment when a wine bottle was thrown wasn't a simple incident. It was Wagner, consumed by fury, throwing the bottle at Walken while shouting, "What do you think you're doing? You want to sleep with my wife." The argument between Wagner and Natalie escalated when she retired to her room. Later, when Natalie tried to end the matter and go to sleep, Wagner followed her, continuing the confrontation. Sometime later, Wagner went to Captain Davern, visibly sweaty and in panic, and ordered him to turn off all the boat's lights and ignore any calls from the coast. Later, Davern claimed that Wagner kept him confined to his quarters, preventing him from giving statements to the police. Moreover, he would have held an improvised meeting in which he ordered both Walken and Davern to remain silent about the discussions that night and provide false statements to the authorities. These allegations led the police to reopen the investigation into Natalie Wood's death in 2012. A new examination of the autopsy information concluded that Natalie died by drowning, but also pointed to indeterminate factors that contributed to her death. In 2018, Wagner was officially declared a person of interest in the case. Natalie's sister, Lana, came forward publicly supporting Davern's statements. In an interview, Lana stated she believed the version presented by the captain, and even confronted Wagner during Natalie's funeral in an attempt to get the truth about what happened that night out of him. This situation culminated in her participation in the TV show Dr. Phil, where, alongside Davern, Lana accused Wagner of being responsible for Natalie's death. Despite this, Lana made it clear that she doesn't believe it was an intentional murder, but rather that Wagner, consumed by rage, made an impulsive decision, or perhaps neglected to help Natalie, when she fell into the water while trying to leave the boat to go to shore, as she had done days before. Despite Lana's accusations, Natalie's daughters, Natasha and Courtney, support the version of events presented by their father. They claim that Wagner did everything to preserve their mother's legacy. Courtney, who isn't even Wagner's biological daughter, adopted his surname, showing loyalty and respect. She publicly declared that she considers Davern an opportunist who would be using the tragedy to promote himself and obtain financial gains. This view finds some support since Davern took 30 years to present his accusations, and on the night of the events, he admitted to being extremely drunk. Moreover, his version of events has changed several times over the years, often involving sensationalist gossip disclosed to tabloids. Davern even wrote a book about the events of that night, but his narrative has been challenged by various people who consider it full of inconsistencies. When questioned about Davern's statements, Natasha, Wagner's biological daughter, supposedly said, "He's someone I can't even dignify with a response because he doesn't deserve it." As for Christopher Walken, the only other person on board the Splendor that night, he has remained strangely silent over the years. When asked about the reopening of the case, his response was vague. "I don't know." In the past, Walken had already declared he believed Natalie's death was just a tragic accident. In summary, it's not impossible to imagine that a highly intoxicated Natalie tried to use the same dinghy she had used 2 nights before. In this process, she could have fallen into the water and drowned, while the other people on board were too drunk to hear her screams, or were simply below deck, unable to perceive what was happening. On the other hand, it's equally disturbing to consider the possibility that a husband consumed by jealousy might have discovered real or imagined infidelities, and in a moment of fury, thrown her into the sea, using his influence or threats to cover up the crime. 39 years have passed since Natalie's death, and the truth about what happened that night is still far from being completely clarified. It's not just her family or friends who deserve answers, but society as a whole. Are we facing a killer who remained among the Hollywood elite for 4 decades, or an innocent man who faced years of accusations while seeking a chance to recover from this loss? Regardless of what really happened on that Thanksgiving holiday, one thing is undeniable. The somber prophecy told to young Maria Gerin by a Chinese fortune teller at the beginning of the last century was tragically fulfilled. It was indeed dark waters that sealed the fate of the woman the world came to know as Natalie Wood. During the Thanksgiving holiday of 1950, a northeastern storm was battering the coast of Massachusetts, hitting hard the small town of Marblehead in the vicinity of Salem. There lived Barrow Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher with a history of dedication to the profession that summed up a quarter of a century. Alone in her house on Sewell Street, she had only the company of Esky, her faithful white Spitz who had remained by her side since the loss of her father. Atherton, who considered herself a woman without close ties of friendship or family, spent her days in a reserved manner. Her favorite pastime was watching classic cinema, and she made solitary trips to a theater in Lynn to satisfy this passion. That Saturday, while cutting winds swept the neighborhood and the sky promised a relentless snowstorm, Barrow made her final preparations. Among her tasks, she visited the market to ensure the necessary provisions, including extra food for Esky. Later, around 6 in the evening, she went out to dispose of the trash, and at this brief moment, she noticed the attentive gaze of a young neighbor behind his house window. She waved gently to the boy, without imagining that this would be the last record of her living presence. For the next few days, the storm fulfilled its promise, and Marblehead was buried under the snow until Monday, November 27th, when the town began to return to routine. That day, the milkman, known as Pint, a habitual figure in the surroundings, went to Barrow's house to make his usual delivery. He would normally leave the milk at the door, but aware of the teacher's fragility, whose weight barely passed 100 pounds, he decided to knock on the door, concerned about the impact of the storm. He called once without response. He tried again, but the silence persisted. Instinctively, he turned the doorknob, noticing that the door was unlocked. He entered the house, calling Barrow's name, and upon reaching the kitchen, encountered a terrifying scene. On the floor, lying face down over a pool of coagulated blood, was Miss Atherton. Beside her, Esky, visibly injured, moaned in pain. Pint, overcome by shock, ran out toward a neighbor's house, calling for help and asking them to call the police immediately. When the authorities arrived, they found that Barrow had already been dead for several days. On the kitchen table, still intact, were the bags with groceries bought at the market. suggesting that the fatal attack happened right after her encounter with the neighbor boy, probably less than an hour after that gentle wave through the window. Barrow Atherton had her life cruelly interrupted. Barrow Atherton's body was found in a state that spoke of relentless and brutal violence. Fractured ribs and deep bruises around her neck indicated that she had been strangled with terrible force, to the point that the marks of the aggressor's nails were still visible on her cold skin. After the strangulation, her assailant used a small blade to cut her throat, but did so in an unusual manner. Besides a horizontal cut, a second vertical cut was inflicted, extending from the ribs to the chin, forming a grotesque cross. The cuts were so deep they almost decapitated her. The blood loss was so great that there were no traces in the blood vessels, forcing the coroner to extract a sample directly from the victim's heart. Before leaving, the aggressor attacked the small Esky, who tried to defend his owner, breaking several of the faithful dog's ribs. However, despite the barbarity, the crime scene revealed little about the culprit's identity. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nor footprints around the house. Even the neighbors, when questioned, couldn't offer any clues. No one besides Esky had seen the killer. If Barrow screamed for help, her pleas were probably muffled by the storm that roared that fateful night. Although the attack was grotesque and violent, there were few indications of a prolonged struggle. The only apparent sign of resistance was a broken necklace, shattered by the impact of the blade, and some of the victim's fingers fractured in a desperate attempt at defense. From all indications, the killer managed to surprise Barrow, approaching her without her perceiving the imminent danger. The lack of useful evidence at the crime scene raised the suspicion that the aggressor might have remained at the location for some time after the attack, carefully erasing any trace of their presence. Because it occurred in the kitchen, it's possible they used available cleaning products to eliminate fibers, fingerprints, and even traces of DNA. The discovery of a diary among Barrow's belongings brought an element of mystery. Although it revealed mentions of some male acquaintances, the content didn't provide sufficient clues to advance the investigation. Friends and acquaintances were surprised to discover she kept these records, as no one was aware of any recent romantic involvement. The diary mentioned a broken relationship that had left her deeply hurt, but even this didn't contribute to elucidating the case. With the police unable to point to suspects or clarify a clear motive, small Marblehead was overtaken by rumors. Some speculated that Barrow led a double life and had become involved with criminal activities in Boston, paying the price for it. Others believed a rejected lover had returned seeking revenge, or even that a relative anxious for an inheritance or fearing being excluded from it had committed the crime. The uncertainties and gossip only served to intensify the climate of tension and mystery that hung over the community. Despite the mystery surrounding the murder, the estate left by Barrow Atherton was modest, totaling about $5,000. No jewelry or valuables seemed to have been taken from the house, which weakened the hypothesis that the crime had a financial motivation. Still, there are those who live in Marblehead and claim to know exactly who was responsible for the brutal attack. A small group of people even claims that the murderer is alive, which, considering their age, probably nearing 80 or 90 years, suggests they may take this secret to the grave without ever facing justice. With the passage of time and the absence of new clues, all indications are that this barbaric crime occurred on a Thanksgiving weekend so distant will remain unsolved. Thus, a cold and implacable murderer seems to have escaped unscathed, free to continue their life, carrying the weight of the cruelest act a human being can commit, and the certainty that they will never pay for it. Years passed, and the case faded from most people's memories, but not from everyone's. Marblehead has transformed over the decades. Modern homes surround Barrow's former residence, which itself was eventually sold, renovated, and changed hands several times. Few of the current residents know its grim history. Detective James Mercer, now retired, kept a box of case notes in his attic for nearly 50 years. At 92, knowing his time was short, he invited a young true crime author to his home in the summer of 2020. "I never stopped thinking about her," Mercer told the author, his hands trembling as he opened the dusty cardboard box. "There was something about that case that never sat right with me, beyond the obvious brutality." Inside the box were crime scene photos, never released to the public, detailed notes from witnesses long dead, and a small leather diary, Barrow's own, which had somehow never made it back to evidence storage. The most striking item, however, was a sealed envelope with theory scrawled across it in faded blue ink. The detective had maintained his own investigation, privately, after the official case went cold. His theory centered on a local physician who had treated both Barrow and her elderly father before his death. The doctor had been interviewed briefly during the initial investigation, but quickly eliminated as a suspect due to his standing in the community and seemingly rock-solid alibi. He claimed to have been attending another patient during the estimated time of Barrow's murder. Mercer had discovered, however, that the other patient had been heavily sedated and wouldn't have known if the doctor had left for an hour or more. More disturbing, he had found a pattern of similar brutal murders in other New England towns where the same doctor had previously practiced, all unsolved, all with female victims living alone, all with the same cross-shaped wound pattern. "I couldn't prove it," Mercer explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was too protected, too respected. The chief shut me down when I tried to pursue it. Said I was obsessed, seeing patterns that weren't there." The doctor in question died in 1973, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. The true crime author published Mercer's findings in a book that became a bestseller, bringing renewed attention to Barrow's case. DNA testing on the diary's cover revealed partial fingerprints that didn't match Barrow's, fingerprints that couldn't be tested against the now-deceased doctor, but added weight to Mercer's theory. The cross-shaped wound, once thought to be random, was discovered to be a specific technique taught in certain European medical schools in the early 20th century, schools the doctor had attended in his youth. The residents of Marblehead now pass by the renovated house on Seawall Street with a different kind of awareness. Some claim to see a woman's silhouette in the kitchen window on snowy November evenings, or hear the faint whimpering of a dog. Whether these are just stories or something more remains, like so much about Barrow Atherton's case, a mystery shrouded in the past. Although it may seem difficult to imagine, There was a time when the campus of Cornell University didn't possess the gigantic proportions it has today. In the 60s, this institution was the central point of a small and charming university town, surrounded by the gentle hills of the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York, affectionately nicknamed Happy Valley. Back then, the local population was smaller than the current number of enrolled students, something almost unimaginable for today's students. It was in this setting that Betsy Arden enrolled at Cornell in 1969. At just 22 years old, she was a graduate student in English after completing her education at the University of Michigan, the state where she was born. Betsy was known for being intelligent, dedicated to her studies, and well-connected. She maintained a deep romance with David Wright, a medical student who, according to reports, was planning to ask for her hand in marriage that year. On November 28th, right after the Thanksgiving holiday, Betsy put on an elegant red dress and dedicated herself to working on a paper for one of her courses. The day went by quietly. She only took a quick break for lunch before heading to the library to continue her work into the early afternoon. The imposing building with great architectural beauty had an entrance adorned with columns that led to a broad pathway. Betsy spent the day focused on her work, even as the sun began to set behind the hills. Determined to finish the paper, she planned to continue studying late into the night. For unknown reasons, she was one of the few students who remained on campus during the holiday, leaving the area practically deserted that weekend. Silence reigned over the campus, and the nearly empty library reflected this quiet even more. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, Betsy decided to explore a section of the library known to students as the Stacks, a labyrinth of old, narrow corridors filled with books. In one of these isolated corridors, far from any company, Betsy was found later unconscious. A library visitor came across the young woman on the floor and alerted a staff member about the situation before quickly leaving the premises. The staff member rushed to Betsy and found her lying face down on the floor, surrounded by scattered books. Despite attempts to wake her, she didn't respond. He then called the emergency services. Paramedics arrived within a short time, facing the heavy traffic typical of the Thanksgiving holiday. Betsy was placed on a stretcher and taken to the nearby Rittenhouse Health Center. This happened at 5:19 in the afternoon, less than an hour after she had been found unconscious. Initially, the first responders believed Betsy had suffered a seizure or another medical complication. Her health condition, however, was rapidly deteriorating. Her blood pressure was dropping, and she had no pulse. Only at the hospital, during the examinations, did the doctors realize what had happened. Betsy had a single stab wound to the chest. The fatal injury that Betsy suffered was a single stab that hit her left breast, penetrating directly into the left ventricle of her heart. The location of the blow meant that blood didn't flow in large quantities outward. Most of it accumulated in her thoracic cavity. The little blood that escaped ended up blending with the red tone of the dress she was wearing, which led the paramedics to delay understanding the gravity of the situation and hesitate about the appropriate treatment. In any case, it's unlikely that the speed of the care would have changed the outcome. It's believed that Betsy died about a minute after being attacked by her unknown aggressor. Whoever attacked her was someone who either knew her or managed to approach her without being noticed. As besides the few books knocked down from the shelf, there were no signs of a struggle. Betsy's body showed no other injuries, scratches, or bruises, indicating she didn't have a chance to react. Additionally, no one reported hearing screams or any noise coming from the location of the attack. All that is known about the moment of the crime is that a mysterious man informed the reception staff that a woman needed medical help, and then left the library without being identified. There was no indication that the crime had motivations related to abuse or harassment. Her clothes were intact, and there were no signs that she had suffered any violence of that type. The attack seems to have been cold and calculated. The aggressor approached, delivered the stab with precision, and fled without raising any alarm. The stab also punctured one of her lungs, causing a blood buildup that made it impossible for Betsy to scream. Despite this, some experts argue that it would be difficult for an attacker to know exactly where to stab to ensure such a result, suggesting that the precision may have been coincidental, as happens in many murders. As happens in many murders in small towns, the crime generated a wave of dismay and sadness in the Cornell community. The population clamored for quick answers, but the investigations didn't advance. No murder weapon was found, and the only concrete clue was the report of the man who left the library after notifying about the emergency. He, however, was never identified, and investigations into Betsy's personal life didn't point to any close suspects. The police interviewed thousands of people, but couldn't obtain any significant leads. For the investigators, the crime could have been committed either by a random killer or by someone very close to the victim. Despite the lack of evidence, some questions stand out. First, Betsy had left the state of Michigan to live in New York precisely during the period when a student killer was active, and the decision seems to have been influenced by concern for her safety. Second, just as in the Sandusky scandal that would shake the university years later, the authorities seem to have prioritized preserving Cornell's reputation instead of efficiently investigating the case. Betsy's murder happened amidst the fervor of protests against the Vietnam War that took over university campuses across the country. The climate of distrust toward authorities, typical of the time, made the student body little collaborative with police investigations, considerably hampering the work of investigators and compromising any chance of significant progress in the case. Over the years, amateur detectives repeatedly pointed to the same name as the main suspect, Richard Hafner, a student on the night of the crime. Richard was staying at the house of one of his professors, and his background was disturbing. He was known for his explosive personality and for the habit of carrying a large knife with him, supposedly for self-defense. Curiously, the professor who hosted him kept these details secret for many years, until Richard violently threatened him when confronted about the incident. Despite this, Richard was never officially arrested or charged, and an important detail weighs against him. The man seen leaving the library right after the attack, considered by the police to be the main person responsible for the crime, was never identified as being Richard Hafner. Although Richard's aggressive behavior in previous situations places him as a natural suspect, there are reasons to question whether he was really the author of the crime. Betsy's murder was meticulously executed with a coldness and precision that didn't match Richard's impulsive and violent profile. This raises the possibility that another person might have been responsible for the attack. Richard died in 2002, eliminating any chance of formally interrogating him. If he was indeed the killer, the opportunity to obtain a clear confession was lost forever. Thus, Betsy's case remains unsolved, one more among so many crimes committed on American university campuses that never find an answer. The person responsible for this cruel and premeditated attack continued unpunished, free to walk the streets of New York for over 50 years. It could be someone ordinary, perhaps a neighbor, a person we see every day, or even someone unexpected, like a close relative. The sad reality is that we may never know who took Betsy's life. In the decades since Betsy's murder, Cornell has changed dramatically. The library where she was killed was renovated in the early 2000s. The old stacks, replaced with modern, open-concept study spaces bathed in natural light. Few students today know that a murder occurred there, though some claim to feel a sudden chill when studying late at night in certain corners of the building. Periodically, the case attracts renewed interest. In 1998, a journalism student wrote her thesis on the murder, digging through archives and tracking down aging professors and classmates who remembered Betsy. Her work uncovered an interesting detail. In the weeks before her death, Betsy had mentioned to a friend that she felt someone was watching her in the library. She dismissed it as paranoia from too many late-night study sessions, but in retrospect, it took on a more ominous tone. In 2015, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence preserved from the crime scene. A partial DNA profile was recovered from the handle of one of the books found near Betsy's body, a book that wasn't part of her research materials and appeared to have been placed there after the attack. The profile didn't match any suspects in the original investigation, including Richard Hafner, whose DNA was obtained from preserved medical samples. This new evidence suggests that Betsy's killer may have been someone entirely unexpected, perhaps even a stranger to the university community. The DNA profile has been entered into national databases, but so far, no match has been found. Some forensic psychologists who have studied the case believe the murder wasn't random, but highly planned, possibly by someone with a specific obsession with Betsy. The precision of the single stab wound, the lack of sexual assault, and the curious detail of the killer alerting staff to her condition all point to a complex psychological profile. As Betsy's classmates have grown old and many have passed away, the possibility of the case being solved through a deathbed confession or a witness finally coming forward grows increasingly remote. Perhaps the only hope now lies in that partial DNA profile and the possibility that someday, somewhere, the killer's genetic information will enter the system and reveal the truth that has remained hidden for over half a century. Until then, Betsy Arden remains a ghost in Cornell's history, a promising young woman whose life was cut short in a moment of inexplicable violence. A reminder that even in the most idyllic of academic settings, darkness can find its way in. Gabriella Hollins, at 41 years old, was working on the morning of March 10, 1997. At the gas station located on Highway 80 in Dawson County, Nebraska. After a turbulent divorce, she was reorganizing her life while caring for her 2 children who remained in her custody. Promoted to manager just the day before, Gabriella was beginning to reap the fruits of her efforts. Those close to her described her as generous, friendly, and kind-hearted. The period after the separation had been particularly difficult, aggravated by the disrespectful behavior of her ex-husband. Still, she finally seemed to be regaining control of her trajectory. The new position at work brought a renewed sense of purpose and accomplishment. But around 10:30 in the morning, a red Pontiac Grand AM entered the gas station parking lot. Security cameras recorded the moment when the driver got out of the car, filled the tank, and entered the store. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary man, except for one detail that drew attention. He was barefoot as he entered the establishment. While he was coming in, Gabriella was attending to a customer, a mother accompanied by her daughter, chatting with them in a relaxed manner while finalizing the payment. The barefoot man remained at the back of the store, discreet, as if waiting for the 2 customers to leave. He picked up a can of soda, opened it, and began drinking, even staring directly at one of the security cameras. As soon as the mother and daughter left the premises, he walked calmly to the counter. There he pulled out a 9mm pistol and pointed it at Gabriella. Although the audio from the security cameras didn't capture his words, Gabriella's subsequent actions suggest that he demanded the money from the cash register. She handed over the cash, and he ordered her to lie down behind the counter. While she obeyed, the man began counting the bills handed over. Abruptly and without any apparent reason, he leaned over the counter and fired 3 times at Gabriella, who was on the floor. The shots were fatal, taking her life instantly. The barefoot man then calmly returned to his red Pontiac and left the location via the highway. The news of Gabriella's death devastated friends and family, who, despite the shock, hoped the case would be solved quickly. The evidence seemed solid. The man had looked directly at one of the cameras, providing the police with a clear image of his face. He was described as a Caucasian man, aged between early 30s and 40, with dark hair and eyes. The red Pontiac Grand AM used in the crime was quickly identified, but the lack of a front license plate and the high-speed escape made it impossible for the police to get any identification of the plate number. The bullets found at the scene were confirmed as 9mm, fired from a compact weapon. However, ballistic analyses showed no connection with other crimes known to the police. The barefoot man left a series of clear fingerprints from the gas pump to the counter, but to the investigators' frustration, none of them were registered in police databases across the state of Nebraska. Despite this, there was something about the way Gabriella was shot that indicated the case wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. One of the shots was directed at the back of her head, and the security images captured the man adjusting his aim to deliver the final shot. This suggested that the murder was premeditated, and that the robbery could have been just a facade to cover up a planned homicide. The police made several appeals for witnesses or people with useful information to come forward, but the few clues obtained didn't lead to significant advances. The case gained even more notoriety when the security footage was shown on the famous television program, America's Most Wanted. Even so, no one was able to identify the suspect. The most plausible explanation at first glance was that the crime was a violent robbery committed by an itinerant criminal who needed money. The images reinforced this theory, showing a confident and methodical man in his actions, characteristics that pointed to a professional with experience in crimes of this type. The police believed this wasn't the barefoot man's first violent robbery, nor would it be his last. The crime also seemed to have striking similarities with other apparently random murders involving gas station employees, crimes that until that moment remained equally unsolved. While investigators tried to piece together the puzzle, uncertain about the true motives for the murder, one person was convinced they knew who was responsible. Jonathan Hollins, Gabriella's brother, didn't hesitate to point the finger at her ex-husband, Barry Rabinovitz. For him, the murder was a direct result of the turbulent divorce the couple had faced years before. Barry, the owner of a successful restaurant in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was a very wealthy man. When Gabriella decided to leave him, she secured a significant sum of money as well as substantial alimony, since she had retained custody of the children. Jonathan revealed that his sister had written a lengthy 16-page letter to her children during the divorce. The document explained the reasons behind her abrupt decision to leave her husband. In it, Gabriella reported years of suffering, detailing episodes of abuse, and describing the growing fear she felt due to Barry's explosive temper and violent nature. When he saw his sister featured on America's Most Wanted, Jonathan Hollins became obsessed with the details of the security footage. He was convinced that the barefoot man was a hitman from the Virgin Islands. In Jonathan's view, the habit of walking barefoot indicated that the suspect was someone accustomed to the tropical climate of the region. He believed that Barry Rabinovitz had hired this man to kill Gabriella, motivated by revenge for the money lost in the divorce and by the desire to regain custody of the children. Barry Rabinovitz passed away in early 2015 without ever being formally accused of involvement in Gabriella's death. Still, he was also never completely ruled out as a suspect. On the other hand, the barefoot man remains an enigma. He was never identified, located, or even linked to new clues. The evidence collected, fingerprints, ballistic data, and security footage, remains archived, while the case continues unsolved in the state of Nebraska. No new information has emerged in the 23 years that have passed since Gabriella's tragic murder. The mystery surrounding her death persists, fueling speculation from unsolved crime enthusiasts worldwide. However, there is a silent hope that one day new evidence will come to light and lead to the identification of the barefoot man, so that justice can finally be served. In the years since Gabriella's murder, her children have grown up and started families of their own. Her daughter Emily, who was only 12 when her mother was killed, became a prosecutor, driven by a desire to bring justice to victims like her mother. Her son Michael followed a different path, moving to the Virgin Islands himself in what some family members saw as a strange attempt to understand the place his stepfather had called home. The case received renewed attention in 2011 when a documentary filmmaker began researching a series about unsolved murders in the Midwest. The filmmaker discovered something curious 3 months before Gabriella's murder. A nearly identical crime had occurred at a gas station in Wyoming. The victim was also a recently divorced woman in her 40s who had just been promoted. The perpetrator in that case was also barefoot, though he drove a different vehicle. That case, too, remained unsolved. More disturbing still, the filmmaker uncovered that between 1995 and 1998, 7 gas station employees across 5 states were murdered in similar execution-style killings. All the victims were women between 35 and 45, and in 5 of the 7 cases, they had recently been through divorces. The filmmaker theorized this could be the work of a serial killer with a specific victim profile, rather than a hitman hired by Barry Rabinowitz. The FBI eventually established a task force to investigate these connected cases, but after 2 years of work, they couldn't definitively link them together. The barefoot man's fingerprints didn't match any in the growing national database, and no DNA evidence was ever recovered from any of the crime scenes. In 2019, a retired detective who had worked on Gabriella's case came forward with a startling revelation. He claimed that certain evidence had been deliberately suppressed during the initial investigation. Specifically, a torn piece of paper found in Gabriella's pocket with a partial phone number written on it. The number had a Virgin Islands area code. This revelation sparked a brief resurgence of interest in the Barry Rabinowitz theory. But without the man himself to question, the lead ultimately went nowhere. The current Dawson County Sheriff maintains that the case remains open and that any credible tips will be thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hollins has never wavered in his belief that his sister was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot. Now in his 70s, he still maintains a website dedicated to solving Gabriella's case, where he posts updates and theories. He's offering a $50,000 reward for information, leading to the identification and conviction of the barefoot man. Someone knows who this man is, Jonathan stated in a recent interview. Maybe it's a relative who recognized him from the footage, but was afraid to come forward. Maybe it's someone who overheard something in a bar years ago. All I know is that my sister deserves justice, and I won't stop until I find it. For now, the barefoot man remains one of America's most infamous unidentified killers. His emotionless face and strange lack of footwear, the only clues to his identity. And somewhere, perhaps, he still walks free, carrying with him the terrible secret of why he took Gabriella Holland's life on that ordinary March morning. On the morning after the Thanksgiving holiday in 2003, the Mountain Pines Retreat Center in Aspen, Colorado, rested in a tranquil winter landscape covered in snow. This serene environment, however, was drastically disrupted when the naked body of a young woman was discovered frozen near one of the cabins at the location. The young woman's name was Natalie Drew. She was 20 years old at the time of her death. Raised in the state of Ohio, she had moved to Florida to begin her university studies. During the summer of that year, she secured a temporary job at Mountain Pines, where a Christian youth camp event took place. It was there that she met her boyfriend, who worked at the center full-time. During the Thanksgiving holiday, Natalie decided to return to Colorado to visit him. Respecting the values of the location, the couple opted to stay in separate cabins. They spent the holiday together, enjoying romantic walks around the retreat grounds. Late in the evening of November 27th, after spending the day with Natalie, her boyfriend left her at her cabin around 11:30 and returned to his own lodging. The next morning, worried when he didn't see her at breakfast, he went to check on her. He discovered that she wasn't in her cabin and noticed bare footprints in the snow. The size and shape of the footprints indicated they belonged to Natalie. He followed them for about 600 feet to an area covered by trees, where he found her body lying in the snow around 8:50 in the morning. The young woman was completely naked. Her skin showed scratches and bruises, and her body was already rigid from rigor mortis. The scene was devastating for the boyfriend, who saw someone so dear to him in such a terrible condition. Sheriff Fred Johnson of Pitkin County stated that there was only one set of footprints in the direction of the body, ruling out the possibility of a pursuit before Natalie's death. He also mentioned that the steps appeared erratic, as if she had been disoriented before falling. The analysis suggested that Natalie had died shortly after entering the snow, possibly between 15 and 20 minutes after being left at her cabin by her boyfriend. An autopsy performed in Eagle County on November 30th indicated that Natalie was in perfect health before the incident. Pine needles stuck in her hair, dirt and scratches on her face and shoulders, plus the disorderly pattern of the footprints, suggest that she collided with trees while running barefoot through the snow. What would have led her to flee from her cabin in such a desperate manner remains a mystery. The injuries observed on Natalie's body included scratches that ran across her forehead, cheeks, neck, chest, abdomen, and legs. Additionally, there were small bruises located above the trachea, on the right cheek, and on the right side of the neck, as well as purplish marks on the left forearm, hand, and wrist. Despite these pieces of evidence, which the coroner attributed to contact with trees and bushes during a possible escape, there was no other visible damage to her body. Curiously, the autopsy also ruled out internal injuries to her brain, eliminating the possibility that hemorrhages or tumors had caused Natalie's strange behavior. Despite the detailed investigation, the exact cause of her death could not be determined. Sheriff Fred Johnson stated that although nothing indicated a crime, the case remained deeply enigmatic. "It's really very strange, but we're still hoping for something more conclusive," he declared. Leroy Bennett from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation corroborated the strangeness of the case, describing it as the most peculiar thing you've ever seen. Without definitive answers, the coroner was forced to list agitated delirium as the probable cause of death. Natalie showed no signs of narcotics or alcohol in her system, but 6 main factors led to this conclusion. The primary point was the fact that she was found completely naked, without signs of pursuit. Additionally, the absence of internal injuries and chemical substances ruled out more evident causes for her death. Another possible element was the impact of the altitude change. Coming from Florida at sea level, her adaptation to the rarefied air of the mountains could have provoked cerebral hypoxia. Elevated glucose levels in her urine also raised the hypothesis of hyperglycemia, which could justify the disoriented behavior. In the days following the tragedy, rumors and speculations about what had happened emerged. Natalie's boyfriend was the target of initial suspicions, as he was the last person to see her alive and the one who found her body. However, the young woman's family always defended his innocence and continues to believe that he had no involvement in her death. Another theory revolved around a possible eating disorder that Natalie might have been facing, suggesting that a cardiac arrest triggered by malnutrition had been responsible. Despite these theories, Natalie's death remains shrouded in mystery, fueled by numerous theories and hypotheses. Even without a definitive explanation, it's certain that she had no history of mental illness, drug use, or health problems until that fateful Thanksgiving weekend. In a sudden and unexplained manner, Natalie seems to have suffered a psychotic break. Just moments before, she had been perfectly fine, accompanied by her boyfriend to the guest cabin. However, in a short time, she had removed all her clothes and run through the snow-covered forest in the dark, at a speed so uncontrolled that she ended up colliding with tree trunks. The episode ended tragically, with her body being found just a few hundred meters from the cabin where she was staying. The situation is deeply intriguing and disconcerting, generating many more questions than answers. The diagnosis of agitated delirium provided by the coroner is particularly controversial. This condition is not officially recognized by institutions such as the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, or the American Medical Association, and therefore does not appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In the United Kingdom, the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody suggested renaming the condition as sudden death in restraint syndrome, highlighting that recorded cases usually occur in contexts where there is some type of restraint attempt. Given this context, it's reasonable to question the validity of this diagnosis in Natalie's case. If we discard it completely, however, we are left with an even greater void, without any explanation that allows us to understand how she lost her life. Did she encounter something or someone near the cabin that triggered such intense panic that it manifested as the supposed delirium? And if so, what could it have been? It's possible to imagine various scenarios. Perhaps she crossed paths with an intruder lurking in the darkness, whose presence awakened such visceral fear that it made her abandon any logic and run naked through the snow. Or maybe it was something even more frightening, a large, threatening wild animal that might have tried to invade the cabin, leaving Natalie with no choice but to flee desperately. Although the exact causes of this terror that night remain shrouded in mystery, there is one thing clear: we will never know exactly what happened to Natalie Drew. This case leaves us with an uncomfortable feeling of vulnerability, reminding us that in the blink of an eye, inexplicable events can transform lives, leaving those who remain bewildered, incredulous, and heartbroken. For years, the strange circumstances of Natalie's death have attracted the attention of both paranormal enthusiasts and medical researchers. The location has since become a minor pilgrimage site for those interested in unexplained deaths and mysterious circumstances. Dr. Helena Rosenthal, a neurologist specializing in altitude sickness, published a paper in 2012 suggesting that Natalie may have experienced a rare and extreme form of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. She theorized that the combination of the sudden altitude change, possible dehydration from traveling, and the stress of the holiday might have triggered an unusual manifestation of the condition. What makes Natalie's case particularly puzzling is the rapid onset and the severe behavioral changes. Dr. Rosenthal wrote, "Typically, HACE develops over days, not hours, but there have been documented cases of extraordinarily rapid progression in susceptible individuals. The paradoxical undressing phenomenon, where hypothermia victims remove their clothing due to a sensation of burning heat caused by peripheral vasodilation, has also been suggested as a partial explanation for why Natalie was found naked. This behavior is well documented in hypothermia cases, though it doesn't explain why she left the cabin in the first place." In 2015, the case gained renewed public interest when a popular true crime podcast dedicated 3 episodes to investigating Natalie's death. The hosts interviewed her boyfriend, who had since married and moved to Washington State. He described the aftermath of finding Natalie's body as the most traumatic experience imaginable, and revealed that he had spent years in therapy dealing with survivors' guilt and trauma. "Not knowing what happened to her is what haunts me the most," he said during the emotional interview. "I've replayed that night in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if I could have done something differently. If I had stayed with her, would she still be alive? That question never leaves me." The podcast also revealed something that hadn't been widely reported. 2 other guests at the retreat that weekend had experienced unusual anxiety and disorientation, though neither to the extreme degree that Natalie had. This led to speculation about environmental factors, including the possibility of carbon monoxide leaking from the cabin's heating system, or an adverse reaction to a cleaning chemical used in the retreat's linens. Tests conducted after Natalie's death ruled out carbon monoxide, and no other significant environmental toxins were found. However, the fact that others experienced milder symptoms suggests something more complex than a purely psychological breakdown. Natalie's family established a scholarship in her name at her university in Florida, awarded annually to students pursuing degrees in elementary education, the field Natalie had been studying. They remain convinced that her death, while mysterious, was the result of a tragic medical event rather than foul play. "We miss her every day," her mother said at the scholarship's 10th anniversary ceremony. "We may never fully understand what happened that night, but we find peace in knowing she was happy in her final days, surrounded by the mountains she loved and the people who cared for her." As for Mountain Pines Retreat Center, they installed additional lighting around all cabins and implemented a buddy system policy where no guest stays alone in a cabin. The cabin where Natalie spent her final night has been repurposed as a storage facility. No one has slept there since that Thanksgiving weekend in 2003. During the Thanksgiving holiday of 1950, a northeastern storm was battering the coast of Massachusetts, hitting hard the small town of Marblehead in the vicinity of Salem. There lived Barrow Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher with a history of dedication to the profession that summed up a quarter of a century. Alone in her house on Sewell Street, she had only the company of Esky, her faithful white Spitz who had remained by her side since the loss of her father. Atherton, who considered herself a woman without close ties of friendship or family, spent her days in a reserved manner. Her favorite pastime was watching classic cinema, and she made solitary trips to a theater in Lynn to satisfy this passion. That Saturday, while cutting winds swept the neighborhood and the sky promised a relentless snowstorm, Barrow made her final preparations. Among her tasks, she visited the market to ensure the necessary provisions, including extra food for Esky. Later, around 6 in the evening, she went out to dispose of the trash. And at this brief moment, she noticed the attentive gaze of a young neighbor behind his house window. She waved gently to the boy, without imagining that this would be the last record of her living presence. For the next few days, the storm fulfilled its promise, and Marblehead was buried under the snow until Monday, November 27th, when the town began to return to routine. That day, the milkman, known as Pint, a habitual figure in the surroundings, went to Barrow's house to make his usual delivery. He would normally leave the milk at the door, but aware of the teacher's fragility, whose weight barely passed 100 pounds, he decided to knock on the door, concerned about the impact of the storm. He called once without response. He tried again, but the silence persisted. Instinctively, he turned the doorknob, noticing that the door was unlocked. He entered the house, calling Barrow's name, and upon reaching the kitchen, encountered a terrifying scene. On the floor, lying face down over a pool of coagulated blood, was Miss Atherton. Beside her, Esky, visibly injured, moaned in pain. Pint, overcome by shock, ran out toward a neighbor's house, calling for help and asking them to call the police immediately. When the authorities arrived, they found that Barrow had already been dead for several days. On the kitchen table, still intact, were the bags with groceries bought at the market, suggesting that the fatal attack happened right after her encounter with the neighbor boy, probably less than an hour after that gentle wave through the window. Barrow Atherton had her life cruelly interrupted. Barrow Atherton's body was found in a state that spoke of relentless and brutal violence. Fractured ribs and deep bruises around her neck indicated that she had been strangled with terrible force, to the point that the marks of the aggressor's nails were still visible on her cold skin. After the strangulation, her assailant used a small blade to cut her throat, but did so in an unusual manner. Besides a horizontal cut, a second vertical cut was inflicted, extending from the ribs to the chin, forming a grotesque cross. The cuts were so deep they almost decapitated her. The blood loss was so great that there were no traces in the blood vessels, forcing the coroner to extract a sample directly from the victim's heart. Before leaving, the aggressor attacked the small Esky, who tried to defend his owner, breaking several of the faithful dog's ribs. However, despite the barbarity, the crime scene revealed little about the culprit's identity. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nor footprints around the house. Even the neighbors, when questioned, couldn't offer any clues. No one besides Esky had seen the killer. If Barrow screamed for help, her pleas were probably muffled by the storm that roared that fateful night. Although the attack was grotesque and violent, there were few indications of a prolonged struggle. The only apparent sign of resistance was a broken necklace, shattered by the impact of the blade, and some of the victim's fingers fractured in a desperate attempt at defense. From all indications, the killer managed to surprise Barrow, approaching her without her perceiving the imminent danger. The lack of useful evidence at the crime scene raised the suspicion that the aggressor might have remained at the location for some time after the attack, carefully erasing any trace of their presence. Because it occurred in the kitchen, it's possible they used available cleaning products to eliminate fibers, fingerprints, and even traces of DNA. The discovery of a diary among Barrow's belongings brought an element of mystery. Although it revealed mentions of some male acquaintances, the content didn't provide sufficient clues to advance the investigation. Friends and acquaintances were surprised to discover she kept these records, as no one was aware of any recent romantic involvement. The diary mentioned a broken relationship that had left her deeply hurt, but even this didn't contribute to elucidating the case. With the police unable to point to suspects or clarify a clear motive, small Marblehead was overtaken by rumors. Some speculated that Barrow led a double life and had become involved with criminal activities in Boston, paying the price for it. Others believed a rejected lover had returned seeking revenge, or even that a relative anxious for an inheritance or fearing being excluded from it had committed the crime. The uncertainties and gossip only served to intensify the climate of tension and mystery that hung over the community. Despite the mystery surrounding the murder, the estate left by Barrow Atherton was modest, totaling about $5,000. No jewelry or valuables seemed to have been taken from the house, which weakened the hypothesis that the crime had a financial motivation. Still, there are those who live in Marblehead and claim to know exactly who was responsible for the brutal attack. A small group of people even claims that the murderer is alive, which, considering their age, probably nearing 80 or 90 years, suggests they may take this secret to the grave without ever facing justice. With the passage of time and the absence of new clues, all indications are that this barbaric crime occurred on a Thanksgiving weekend so distant will remain unsolved. Thus, a cold and implacable murderer seems to have escaped unscathed, free to continue their life, carrying the weight of the cruelest act a human being can commit, and the certainty that they will never pay for it. Years passed, and the case faded from most people's memories, but not from everyone's. Marblehead has transformed over the decades. Modern homes surround Barrow's former residence, which itself was eventually sold, renovated, and changed hands several times. Few of the current residents know its grim history. Detective James Mercer, now retired, kept a box of case notes in his attic for nearly 50 years. At 92, knowing his time was short, he invited a young true crime author to his home in the summer of 2020. "I never stopped thinking about her," Mercer told the author, his hands trembling as he opened the dusty cardboard box. "There was something about that case that never sat right with me, beyond the obvious brutality." Inside the box were crime scene photos, never released to the public, detailed notes from witnesses long dead, and a small leather diary, Barrow's own, which had somehow never made it back to evidence storage. The most striking item, however, was a sealed envelope with theory scrawled across it in faded blue ink. The detective had maintained his own investigation, privately, after the official case went cold. His theory centered on a local physician who had treated both Barrow and her elderly father before his death. The doctor had been interviewed briefly during the initial investigation, but quickly eliminated as a suspect. due to his standing in the community and seemingly rock-solid alibi. He claimed to have been attending another patient during the estimated time of Barrow's murder. Mercer had discovered, however, that the other patient had been heavily sedated and wouldn't have known if the doctor had left for an hour or more. More disturbing, he had found a pattern of similar brutal murders in other New England towns where the same doctor had previously practiced, all unsolved, all with female victims living alone, all with the same cross-shaped wound pattern. "I couldn't prove it," Mercer explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was too protected, too respected. The chief shut me down when I tried to pursue it. Said I was obsessed, seeing patterns that weren't there." The doctor in question died in 1973, taking whatever secrets he might have had to the grave. The true crime author published Mercer's findings in a book that became a bestseller, bringing renewed attention to Barrow's case. DNA testing on the diary's cover revealed partial fingerprints that didn't match Barrow's, fingerprints that couldn't be tested against the now-deceased doctor, but added weight to Mercer's theory. The cross-shaped wound, once thought to be random, was discovered to be a specific technique taught in certain European medical schools in the early 20th century, schools the doctor had attended in his youth. The residents of Marblehead now pass by the renovated house on Seawall Street with a different kind of awareness. Some claim to see a woman's silhouette in the kitchen window on snowy November evenings, or hear the faint whimpering of a dog. Whether these are just stories or something more remains, like so much about Barrow Atherton's case, a mystery shrouded in the past. I used to work at a place called Olson's General Store here in Whitefish, Montana. It was one of those traditional stores, a mix of warehouse and convenience store that sold a little bit of everything, from buckets and barrels to books and pocket watches, not to mention the usual groceries and alcoholic beverages. For a young person like me, it was a good job with generally cordial and well-intentioned customers. Of course, every now and then some persistent drunk would show up who would get irritated when I wouldn't sell liquor on a Sunday. But no one had ever threatened me with a weapon. However, that doesn't mean I haven't experienced situations that made me feel the presence of something greater. One of them happened on a Saturday night when I was working late, organizing the shelves and giving the store a general cleaning. Suddenly, the door opened, and a man walked in wearing an impeccable black suit. It was one of those that looked tailored, so well-fitted that they conveyed an air of sophistication, and to me, clearly indicated that he wasn't from the area. But the suit was the only thing that seemed normal about that guy. He had an extreme paleness, almost cadaverous, as if life had abandoned his face a long time ago. His features were incredibly striking, and his silver hair was impeccably slicked back. As soon as the doorbell rang, I went to the counter to attend to him, and when I faced him, he approached with a smile that seemed more predatory than that of a customer. He asked me for a can of lighter fluid. I went to fetch the item, trying to keep the conversation light while I rang up the purchase. I asked where he was from. "From Washington, D.C., he replied naturally. Just passing through, I returned a polite smile. "Politics, I imagine." He gave a vague response, something along those lines. Then he took out a wad of cash like I had never seen before, full of $100 bills. and left one on the counter. While I was returning the change, I commented half-jokingly that it had been lucky the store was busy that night, because otherwise he would have taken all my change. I thought he would laugh or at least smile, but he remained impassive. Calmly, he pulled a Zippo lighter out of his suit pocket. It was the most gleaming lighter I had ever seen, seemingly silver-plated, and began to fill it right there in front of me. I had seen many of these lighters, but never one that looked so expensive. I imagined he was preparing to smoke something special and commented on this, to which he responded in an unexpected way, saying he didn't smoke. The moment he finished filling the Zippo, he accidentally dropped some fluid on his finger before closing the lighter. He brought the finger to his mouth and sucked the flammable liquid as if it were artisanal wine. I was paralyzed, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. I took a step back instinctively, and he noticed. In response, he gave me another one of those sinister smiles, as if he took pleasure in making me uncomfortable. I was about to ask what the hell that was when the doorbell rang again. I looked at the door and saw a girl enter who didn't seem to be more than 14 years old, about the age of my younger sister. However, the way she was dressed was much more childish, as if she were much younger. She wore a denim skirt decorated with white flower embroidery, something that seemed more appropriate for a small child. As soon as she entered, she called the man in the suit Papa, which led me to conclude she was his daughter, and asked to use the bathroom. The man then turned to me and politely asked if there was a bathroom available for her. I took the bathroom key that we had inside the store and handed it to him, but instead of passing it directly to the girl, he took something from his pocket, a small leather pouch similar to a wallet, and gave it to her along with the lighter and the key. Without saying anything more, the girl went to the bathroom and closed the door behind her, locking it. A profound uneasiness began to grow within me. There was something strange about the entire situation. The small leather pouch he had given her made me uneasy. I had an idea of what might be in there, but it was just a hunch, and I didn't have the courage to confront him about it. Besides, the two didn't look alike at all. The girl had a delicate, round face with very curly hair, while the man had sharp, marked features, so defined they seemed carved with a knife. And that Papa she used when referring to him seemed so out of place for a girl of that age. It would be more natural to call him Dad or something similar, but not Papa in such a childish way. Trying to ignore the discomfort, I made conversation to divert the focus. I asked where he and the girl were heading. "You're very curious, aren't you?" he responded, his voice losing the polite tone it had before. Instead, he began to stare at me intensely. His eyes were such a dark brown, they almost seemed black. Those eyes caused a shiver to run through me. They had something cold, empty, as if they didn't carry any human emotion. "Just trying to be polite," I responded, shifting uncomfortably behind the counter. "You know what they say about curiosity, don't you?" He retorted in a low, almost whispered voice, without any trace of warmth or feeling. Curiosity killed the cat. After that, he turned and began to walk through the aisles, looking at the products with an air of someone evaluating antiquities from a forgotten village, which, thinking about it now, our store actually was. I returned to work, or at least tried to. I cleaned the shelves automatically, but without taking my eyes off him. I thought it wouldn't take long for the girl to come out of the bathroom, and he would continue on his journey. But the minutes passed, 5, 10, and she didn't appear. I was about to ask if he thought something had happened when I heard the sound of the bathroom lock being unlocked. The door opened slowly, but no sound came from there, not even the sound of a flush, which would be expected if she had been using the bathroom for its intended purpose. When the girl came out, she seemed dazed, almost as if in a trance. She walked up to the man in the suit and returned the key, the lighter, and the leather pouch with slow gestures. Her voice came out soft, sleepy. "Thank you, Papa." But there was something in the way she spoke that made me absolutely certain that man was not her father. The word came out loaded with something wrong, something dark. And the look he gave her was a look that no father should, under any circumstances, give to a daughter. It was a look that made me nauseated, and at that moment, I knew I needed to get them out of my store as soon as possible. Where I'm from, we're rarely direct to the point. We prefer to say something that has meaning between the lines, if you know what I mean. "Have a good journey now," was what I managed to say to the man in the suit, in a tone that sounded friendly. However, my look conveyed the opposite, loaded with suspicion. He stopped, turned slowly, and stared at me with a disconcerting intensity, as if he were evaluating me, ready to pierce me with that predatory gaze. Without breaking eye contact, he approached the counter, placed the bathroom key on it, and said with a disturbing calmness, "Never forget, young man, curiosity killed the cat." Without another word, he turned, went to get the girl, and the two left the store, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I seriously thought about calling the sheriff as soon as they left, but what could I say? That a man was traveling with a girl who appeared to be his daughter. There was nothing explicitly suspicious about that, at least nothing that could be proven. I could mention the leather pouch he had given her, and say I had a bad feeling about its contents, but I was certain that nothing I said would be enough to incriminate him. That figure exuded money and power, and the look he gave me left no doubt that he knew it. So I stayed silent. I didn't tell anyone anything. However, for the rest of my shift that night, and for several days afterward, his words didn't leave my mind. Whenever the memory of that scene came back, I heard his cold voice echoing with clarity. Curiosity killed the cat. Before going to the next shift, I mentioned the incident to my manager, trying to be casual about it. Had a weird customer the other night. Man in a fancy suit with a young girl. Something felt off about them. My manager raised an eyebrow. Suit guy. Dark eyes, silver hair. Creepy vibe, I nodded surprised. You've seen him once or twice. Always with different girls. He lowered his voice. I reported him to the sheriff after the first time. Nothing came of it. Said without evidence they couldn't do anything. But the leather pouch. The lighter, I asked. Look, kid, he sighed. This town sees all kinds passing through. Unless we catch someone in the act, it's just suspicion. And suspicion isn't enough. 3 weeks later, I was working the night shift again when the local paper caught my eye. A small article on page 3 reported that a girl's body had been found near the highway, about 50 miles south of town. She was estimated to be 14 years old. No identification. She'd been missing for approximately 2 weeks before being discovered by a hiker. The description matched the girl I'd seen that night. Curly hair, small frame. The article mentioned She'd been found wearing a denim skirt with white flower embroidery. I called the sheriff's office immediately. When I explained what I'd seen that night, the deputy who took my statement seemed skeptical at first. But when I mentioned the embroidered skirt, a detail that hadn't been published, his tone changed. "We'll need you to come in and make a formal statement," he said, suddenly all business. "Can you identify this man if you see him again?" "Absolutely," I replied. "I'll never forget his face." They created a composite sketch based on my description, which was circulated to law enforcement agencies across several states. 6 days later, I received a call from the sheriff himself. "We might have something," he said. "There's been a series of similar cases, young girls gone missing, then found days or weeks later. Always near highways, always with certain similarities in condition." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The FBI is involved now. They want to talk to you." 2 agents came to interview me the next day. I told them everything I could remember: the man's appearance, his mannerisms, the leather pouch, the way he drank the lighter fluid, the girl's trance-like state when she emerged from the bathroom. The female agent exchanged a glance with her partner when I mentioned this last detail. "We believe this man may be connected to at least 7 cases across 5 states, she explained afterward. "The girls are all given drugs, usually in bathrooms of rest stops or stores like yours. They're kept compliant for several days before. She didn't need to finish." I understood. They set up surveillance at our store for 3 weeks, hoping he might return to his hunting ground. He never did. But my description led to his identification through security footage from other locations: a truck stop in Idaho, a gas station in Oregon, a diner in Washington. The man's name was Edmund Farley, a former pharmaceutical executive who had made millions before taking early retirement. He had homes in D.C., Florida, and overseas. No criminal record. Respected member of his community. Widowed with no children of his own. It took 8 months before they finally caught him. He was attempting to lure a young girl at a mall in Spokane. When they searched his car, they found the leather pouch containing various sedatives, zip ties, the silver Zippo lighter, and detailed maps marking remote locations across the Northwest. The FBI agent called to tell me the news. "We wouldn't have identified him without your statement," she said. "The detail about the lighter fluid was key. It's part of his ritual. He'd make the girls watch him drink it before." She paused. "Well, we found videos. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. When Farley's case went to trial, I was called to testify. As I took the stand and faced him across the courtroom, he stared at me with those same empty eyes. There was no anger, no fear, just that same cold, calculating gaze I remembered. As the prosecutor questioned me about that night, I could see Farley's lips curve into that familiar, predatory smile. When I finished my testimony and was about to step down, he whispered something just loud enough for me to hear: curiosity. The trial lasted 3 weeks. They found evidence connecting him to 11 murders spanning nearly a decade. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. I still work at Olson's General Store, though not the night shift anymore. I can't shake the feeling that if I had acted sooner, if I had trusted my instincts, and called the sheriff that very night, That girl with the curly hair and the embroidered skirt might still be alive. Sometimes when I'm closing up, I think I see a tall figure in a black suit standing in the shadowy corner of the parking lot. But when I look again, there's nothing there. Just darkness. I've learned to trust that feeling in my gut when something seems wrong. I've also learned that some kinds of curiosity, the kind that makes you speak up when something feels off, can save lives. The cat might have died, but silence kills too. My name is Fernanda, and I was born in San Antonio, Texas. I want to share a special story about the gifts that pass from one generation to another. My mother always said that with time, I would end up attracting things I couldn't see, but I never took it seriously. Among the grandchildren in the family, I was the only one who had the fortune to meet our great-grandmother. She was an impressive woman, full of energy. She knew how to cure ailments like susto, fight sickness, and performed healing rituals using pepper, eggs, and basil leaves. She was undoubtedly the great guardian of our house against spiritual forces. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2016, a victim of a botched operation at a local hospital. She was quite elderly by then, 95 years old. About a month after her departure, I began to face some health problems, nothing serious from a medical standpoint. But spiritually, I was told there was something strange. They said I carried a spirit around me, something that suffocated me and caused chest pains. I still didn't understand what was happening. I wasn't born with the gift of seeing what others can't see, but it seems it was awakening in me gradually. I began to notice fleeting figures that clearly didn't belong to the physical world. Our old house, made of brick and mud, is right in the center of the city and has a cistern in the backyard. My family decided to build a larger, more modern home, but I still felt a strong connection to that old structure. In early 2017, my gift became more evident. I not only saw those presences, but they started to speak to me, seeking my attention. Although it was something I was already familiar with, I confess I was always very afraid. It was on a day in May of that year that something unforgettable happened. I was lying in the bedroom I shared with my mother, whose door opened to the large patio of the house. I clearly heard her voice calling me, asking for help. Without hesitation, I ran to her and asked what was happening, but I got no response. I thought perhaps she needed help collecting clothes from the clothesline, as the washing machine had just turned off. I grabbed some pieces of clothing and went to the darkest corner of the patio where the clotheslines were. While hanging the clothes, I heard a sound like a branch being broken by someone. My dog Pato, who was by my side, became alert and looked fixedly in the same direction I was looking. I ignored it and continued with the task, but suddenly I heard my mother's voice again, asking for help. Help me in this silence. I turned to see what was happening, and while moving a shirt on the clothesline, I came face to face with a woman's completely disfigured face. Panic took over. I dropped everything and ran back to the bedroom, while my dog barked at the emptiness. Arriving at the bedroom, I saw that my mother was in the bathroom the whole time. When she came out, I asked if she had heard anything. Upon telling her what happened, she believed me. She always did. We decided to investigate, but we found nothing. just the clothes I had hung now thrown on the ground, as if something had ripped them off. We decided to try to forget the episode and sleep. However, around 2:30 in the morning, the television in my deceased grandmother's empty room turned on by itself, with the volume at maximum. There was no one else in the house besides my mother, my dogs, and me. "Let's see what's going on," my mother said firmly. With my heart racing and trembling hands, I accompanied my mother to check what was happening. We decided to disconnect the television, but when turning to a corner of the room, I encountered something I could never understand. The remote control was suspended in the air, as if an invisible hand was holding it. As soon as my eyes fell on it, it fell onto the bed as if it had been released. Without thinking twice, we ran back to my room and my mother lit a candle. While she tried to calm down and fall asleep, I remained awake, trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts, and with fear stamped on my face. It was already dawn, and around 3 o'clock in the morning, I noticed that my mother had finally fallen asleep. Despite this, I remained motionless, forcing myself to close my eyes. It was then that I heard a sound coming from the window, something that seemed like a light knock. To not wake my mother, I turned my head slowly, and there she was. The same disfigured woman I had seen in the patio was peeking through the window, standing as if waiting for something from me. As if my body had frozen, I couldn't emit any sound. We remained like this, both motionless, for minutes that seemed like an eternity. I knew she was after me, looking for me. My only escape was to squeeze my eyes shut and pray, with all the fervor I could muster. I begged God for protection, asked Him to free us from that presence, because I feared as much for myself as for my mother. Among the prayers, I told her that I didn't know what she wanted, but that I couldn't help her. That night seemed endless. I felt like I was trapped in an interminable nightmare. Before I realized it, I saw my mother in front of me, holding a large candle, an egg, a pepper, and basil leaves. She wanted to awaken me, bring me back from that dream that seemed to suck the life out of me. I saw myself motionless, crying and suffocated, unable to breathe or react. To this day, it's hard to believe that was a dream, but a dream that almost took my life. My mother told me that I stopped breathing for a few minutes. Since then, I've never experienced anything so frightening. However, many people who have visited our house and heard my story have said that that woman didn't want help. She wanted me. After my great-grandmother's death, I realized that something had broken. Our house became vulnerable, open for spirits to enter, and as someone with the gift of attracting them, I seemed to be a target. Today, at 22, I still see many inexplicable things. Almost 5 years have passed since that experience, and with all my heart, I hope never to experience something similar again. That night I felt I was dying, not just physically, but inside. I no longer live in that house. I now live in Dallas, but even from afar, the souls that wander this world continue to find me. The difference is that I've learned to ignore them. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. I hope it serves as a warning. Prepare yourselves, learn about these energies, because the gifts we inherit can reach us without warning, as happened to me. The years following that incident were a journey of learning for me. My mother, who had always been attuned to the spiritual world, took it upon herself to teach me how to manage my emerging abilities. She explained that what happened that night was a form of initiation. A powerful spirit had attempted to possess me, seeing me as a vulnerable vessel after my great-grandmother's passing. The gifts we inherit are like double-edged swords, she told me. They allow us to see beyond the veil, but also make us visible to what lies beyond it. We consulted with a respected curandera from the outskirts of San Antonio, an elderly woman who had known my great-grandmother. She performed Olympia, a spiritual cleansing ritual using sage, copal incense, and prayers that mixed Catholic traditions with much older practices. During the ceremony, she fell into a trance-like state and spoke directly to me in a voice unlike her own. "Your grandmother's gift didn't pass to your mother fully," she said. "It waited, gathering strength, until you were born. The spirits know this. They've been watching you since childhood, waiting for the guardian to leave so they could approach." The curandera taught me protective practices, salt lines at thresholds, special prayers before bed, and most importantly, how to strengthen my inner boundaries. "Your fear draws them in," she explained. "Your fascination invites them closer. Learn indifference, and they will lose interest." Learning indifference was the hardest part. How do you ignore a figure standing at the foot of your bed, or whispers that come from empty corners? But gradually, I developed what my mother called the distant gaze, a way of acknowledging the presence without engaging with it. There were still incidents. During my first year at college in Dallas, my roommate complained about strange knocking sounds that kept her awake at night. Items would go missing, only to reappear in unexpected places. One morning, she woke to find all her makeup arranged in a perfect circle on the bathroom floor. After she moved out, I performed the cleansing ritual the curandera had taught me. The disturbances stopped for a while, but I knew they would never completely disappear. This was my inheritance, as much a part of me as my grandmother's high cheekbones and my mother's deep-set eyes. Now I work as a counselor at a women's shelter, where my gift serves a different purpose. I can often sense when a woman isn't telling the whole truth about her situation, or when a child is holding back something important. I don't need to see spirits to know when someone is haunted. Sometimes, late at night, I still sense movements at the edge of my vision. Occasionally, I wake to find my dog staring intently at an empty corner of the room. But I've learned to live alongside these experiences rather than in fear of them. My great-grandmother once told my mother that our family's gift wasn't meant to frighten us, but to remind us that reality is more complex than what most people perceive. "We see the world as it truly is," she said, "with all its layers and shadows. That knowledge brings responsibility. I've come to appreciate that wisdom. The gift that once terrified me now helps me understand the unseen struggles others carry. When a client at the shelter tells me she feels like something dark is following her, I don't dismiss it as imagination or trauma. I know that sometimes the shadows we sense are real. I still visit my family's old house when I return to San Antonio. The disfigured woman has never appeared again, but I feel her presence lingering in the dark corners of the patio. Perhaps she's found someone else to seek out, or perhaps she remains, waiting for another in our family line to inherit the gift. Either way, I no longer fear her. We've reached an understanding of sorts. I acknowledge her existence, and she keeps her distance. After all, We're both simply trying to navigate the complex layers of a world most people never fully see. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.